Imagine being offered a contract job that fits your needs, your interests, and your curiosity. You're practically the best person available to do the job since it involves your interests, and you have proven yourself to be capable of completing the contract job with a quality above what was expected. And above all, it pays a whole lot. The catch? You're going to have to go to a remote location and live in isolation while you're completing the contract. There's no set end date for the contract, as it will only end once you complete the contract, so you could be out there all alone for quite a while, depending on the speed that you complete the job. Welcome to the 2022 Netflix show Archive 81. Act 1. Found footage. All 8 episodes of Archive 81 was released on Netflix worldwide on January 14, 2022. The show, developed for the streaming service by Rebecca Sonnenschein, who has worked as an executive producer for multiple series like The Boys and The Vampire Diaries, served as executive producer and showrunner of Archive 81. The show is based on the popular 2016 to 2019 scripted fiction podcast of the same name, created by Daniel Powell and Mark Solinger, who play the podcast's male lead and his best friend respectively. The Netflix adaptation stars, and I apologize now if I've absolutely butchered these names, Mamadou Atir as Daniel Turner, Matt McGorry as Mark Higgins, the Netflix show's version of the podcast's co-creators' characters, as well as Dina Shahabi as Melody Pendris. Originally, this video was supposed to be about both the Archive 81 podcast and Netflix show. However, I never realized how much I can talk about a subject that I'm passionate about until I actually sit down and start to write the script. So instead, I will be splitting it up into 2 videos. With all that said, this will be your final spoiler warning, as I will be recapping all 8 episodes of the Netflix show in this first video, and will be recapping all 35 episodes of the podcast in the next. Though I will occasionally reference my limited knowledge of events depicted in season 1 of the podcast to compare with how the Netflix show has adapted certain aspects, so there'll be those spoilers in this video too. Act 2. Finding the Signal. The discovery of both the Netflix show adaptation and Archive 81 podcast stemmed from my search to find something similar to the wonderfully made, meticulously realized, scripted fiction horror podcast, The Magnus Archives. TMA, as it is affectionately abbreviated to, is a masterclass in episodic yet serialized short horror stories with a marvelous meta-narrative. I won't be going too deep into TMA as it is not the subject of these 2 videos, but let me say that if you're someone who's only dipping their toes into the fictional scripted side of podcasts, especially in the horror genre like I am, then TMA is most likely the best series that utilizes the unique medium of an audio podcast. I have to admit that I made the unfortunate, but I wouldn't have it any other way, mistake of consuming TMA before other podcasts, as every horror fictional podcast that even has a smidgen of similarity or concept that is slightly similar to TMA has the unfortunate disadvantage of being compared to TMA. However, luckily I found that while certain small aspects of Archive 81 reminded me of TMA, it didn't feel like a clear copycat, and had its own storytelling and meta-narrative gimmick that helped set itself apart from TMA. It also helped that the first 2 episodes of the podcast seemed eerily familiar to me. That was because I had in fact watched the first 40 minutes of the first episode of the Netflix show on release, not clocking the fact that it was an adaptation of a podcast at the time. In fact, the show was released before I had even seen the viral clowncore trend that led me to discovering TMA in the first place. I'll showcase the trend in the Magnus Archive recap videos that I will inevitably end up making, as they are easily worthy of having a series dedicated to them, but that will be then. And right now, it's Archive 81's turn. But before I get to the recap, I have to mention that I have set up a Patreon for this new kind of content that I've started on my channel, starting with the Stargate and Stargate SG-1 videos, where as a paid Patreon member, you'll be able to get sneak peeks and progress updates on my latest video projects and stories, the extended filter-free original cuts of the projects a day before their YouTube counterparts are published, unedited first impressions videos and MP3s of me reacting and discussing to the different media that I'm making videos on. For example, all 8 episodes of the Netflix show, as well as reacting to all 35 episodes of the podcast to make these 2 videos, will be on the Patreon, and much more exclusive content and rewards for paying members. And as I am fully into being completely transparent about the video making process, there will also be weekly progress updates for free members of the Patreon. So even if you're unable to support me monetarily in that way, you're still going to be able to stay in the loop when it comes to my videos, starting with this Archive 81 video. That's enough selling myself out for now. Like my other videos about Stargate and SG-1, all opinions present in this video are simply that, my subjective personal opinions. If any part of the video piques your interest in either the podcast or the Netflix show, then please go and support the original creators of the media, as without them, there wouldn't be this video. So let's talk about it. Act 3. A clip show. Before I get into the recap, I'd like to try something different by beginning by talking about the cold opens, the opening credits, and the show's reverence of different forms of TV and video media. Apart from the first and 8th episodes, every cold open of Archive 81 faithfully recreates the style and vibe of various classic TV segments, from a clip of an educational show, to a cheesy TV ad spot for a company, to a nostalgic 90s news show opening. These cold opens relate either or both to the events of the episode and the episode title. The first and 8th episode cold opens are presented as found footage from different types of cameras, and these cold opens are perfect in setting the mood and setting up intrigue in the audience for the upcoming episode, and are always accompanied by a professionally done schmick Netflix opening credits. I won't be showing the Netflix opening credits on the video because of content ID reasons, but pay attention to the disparate shots and items showcased in the opening credits sequence, as absolutely everything shown relate to events of the whole series. As a major part of the show takes place in 1994, hey, that's the year I was born. The show pays close attention to the technology and forms of video media that was available at the time, which provides the show with quite a nostalgic and authentic feeling, as everyone involved seems to have revered that era of video technology. But you'll get more insights to that in the recap, hopefully. So let's begin. Episode 1. Mystery Signals. It's going to be quite difficult to recap this show without utilizing the play-by-play, scene-by-scene style of recapping that was prevalent in the first version of the script, as the show has tight writing and frequently blends the two timelines of events to exemplify important story moments, but I will try my best. As previously mentioned, the first episode's cold open is presented as found footage from a handheld camera. An extended version of the cold open clips will be shown at the episode's cliffhanger, so I'll begin the recap from the point in the episode after the opening credits. One thing that the Netflix show does well, especially in this first episode, is utilizing the different medium of a TV show compared to an audio podcast, and using that extra time present in a TV show to delve deeper into the characterization of the male lead, the concept, setting, and mysteries of the show. The use of filters and mirroring the episode clips are only here to try and get past YouTube's extremely restrictive and easily abused content ID system that previously bullied me into submission in my previous videos on Stargate and Stargate SG-1. Remember, if you want early access to the unfiltered, unmirrored, extended original cuts of the content I'm making, as well as see my unedited reactions watching this show live, basically, practically live, consider becoming a paying member of my Patreon to have access to the first impressions and much more exclusive behind the scenes content. The link will be in the description. We meet Dan as we're quickly and beautifully introduced to his affinity for older media, as he talks to the VHS street vendor as well as collecting old media in his spare time before work. This affinity and almost obsession is also doubled down on when we see that Dan works in the Museum of the Moving Images as a restorationist of visual media. At this point of writing, I have still only listened to the podcast once, and from how I'm understanding it, Podcast Dan is more akin to being an audio technology enthusiast, while on the Netflix show, Dan is seemingly more hands-on with the media he's in contact with. Throughout the series, Dan is shown to be extremely capable, familiar, and skilled at restoring old tapes and even digitizing them. Also, I have to say that not only Mamadou Atia, but every single actor casted for this show absolutely nailed their respective roles. It also helps that Mamadou has an amazingly soothing voice. Anyway, this change in Dan's occupation is a welcome one, especially with the move to the visual medium. I believe it would be very boring to have Dan simply listen to audio tapes throughout the whole series. We get a glimpse of Dan expertly repairing an old film tape, and while watching the contents of the tape to ensure that there are no problems, one of Dan's colleagues asks him about the film tape. I'll let Dan explain the circle, as it is an integral part of the series, with even a whole episode named after it.
What is it?
The Circle. Horror anthology, 1958. Sort of like a pre-Twilight Zone kind of thing.
I've never heard of it.
Oh, it's because it never aired. William Crest died and all the tapes disappeared.
Dan is given an envelope with a mysterious video cassette tape that he's been asked to restore off the books from his supervisor. Intrigued by what could be in the video cassette tape, Dan takes it home and repairs it that night after a quick repair montage, one of many in the series, and we watch the contents of the tape with Dan. Meet Melody Pendris, the female lead of the show, as she is filmed by her housemate and best friend Annabelle Cho. I'll let Melody introduce herself properly, but remember Annabelle, because she'll be integrally involved with the events of the series soon.
I'm Melody Pendris, doctoral candidate in sociocultural anthropology at NYU. My upcoming research project will examine a small New York City community. Residents of the Vista apartment building in the East Village as individuals adapt to cultural shifts at the end of the 20th century.
Due to the nature of the show, a major part of it is told through Melody's handheld camcorder. And even though I've never personally gone sick from watching found footage media, I have to warn people that there might be parts of the show that may give them motion sickness, though thankfully the handheld sequences in Archive 81 are not as horrible as the ones in Cloverfield. And I have to give credit where credit's due, as everyone involved in creating these handheld sequences have done a great job in making them seem as realistic as possible. From the actors' performances to the writing and directing, watching these tapes really does feel like Dan and the audience, us, are but mere voyeurs into mostly private moments in these characters' lives. The contents of this tape, let's call it Tape 1, shows only the most basic premise of the 1994 storyline. Since Melody mentioned the Vista apartment building in the footage, Dan Googles it only to find that the building mysteriously burnt down in late 1994 that left 13 people missing. This smoothly sets up one of the first main mysteries of the show. Why and how did the Vista building burn down? Another welcome change for the Netflix show compared to the original podcast is the show's treatment of Dan's best friend Mark. The show does an incredible job in expanding and exploring Mark's character, making him a more sympathetic and lovable character. As part of the limitation of the audio podcast medium, and partly because of the context that the podcast's meta-narrative exists in, Podcast Mark is a rather underutilized and undercharacterized character. Throughout the first season of the podcast, Mark seems to exist purely to be the in-character, in-universe ending credits guy, listing the credits, mentioning the copyright status of the podcast, notifying the listener with a short update of the current situation of missing best friend podcast Dan, as well as reminding the listener to engage with the podcast's real-life social media links to drum up engagement. Like how the show handles the changes in Dan's character, TV Mark is more directly connected to the events of the series. A major change in this case is the fact that Mark knows exactly where Dan is, has almost regular contact with Dan in the show, and even visits Dan a couple of times. Dan and Mark share a lot of scenes together, and this lets the viewer connect with both characters easier. Due to the restrictions of the podcast's context, Mark is unfortunately relegated into the kinda shitty friend who's desperately trying to find his missing friend that he kinda lost touch with for a while. On the show, Mark is instead a really incredibly good best friend, always on the lookout for Dan. We are introduced to Mark when Dan attends a live recording of Mark's radio play / podcast Mystery Signals, which is a clever nod to the original Archive 81 podcast, as well as the diegetic mention of the episode title. The next day, Dan's supervisor mentions that his work on restoring Melody's tape was amazing, and that the client, a big donor to the museum, would like to thank Dan in person. She gives him the business card for a Virgil Davenport, the president of a massive and powerful conglomerate, LMG. We never get to truly find out what LMG is in both the show and the podcast, simply being the in-universe stand-in of a business conglomerate with too much power and sway in too many fields, but that's only because it doesn't matter who or what LMG is in the events of the story. Meeting Davenport, the older man offers an exclusive contract job for Dan to restore the rest of Melody's tapes that were recovered from the wreckage of the Vista apartment building. Dan initially turns down the offer as he is slightly freaked out by Davenport's and LMG's ability to find out information about him, something that Dan has tried to keep a secret from others. But seemingly what we found out is a big house fire took the lives of Dan's whole family when he was really young. Back in his apartment, whilst rewatching a copy of the digitized footage in tape 1, Dan notices a photo of Melody and his childhood family pet dog, Cleo, in the background of Melody's and Annabelle's apartment. After voicing his thoughts with Mark in the latter's apartment, Dan decides to finally accept the LMG contract, seeing that the picture of Cleo in tape 1 is a sign of some sort. The following sequence of Davenport driving with Dan to the remote location of the LMG compound that houses the rest of the Vista tapes and provides him with a quick orientation of the compound is interestingly where the first episode of the podcast chose to start. Tape 1 was the least damaged of all the Vista tapes, categorized by LMG as Archive 81, and due to the fragility of the rest of the archive, Dan will have to restore and digitize the archive on location in the remote LMG compound. The compound is kitted with all the technology and tools that Dan would require to complete his contracted job, as well as being fully stocked with food and other amenities that are regularly restocked for the entirety of Dan's stay at the compound. The only thing that the compound does not have is the internet and a solid mobile service, or cell service as the Americans call it, though Davenport assures the compound has an amazing landline that is definitely not tapped into. Before Davenport leaves, he hands Dan something like a Fitbit, and Davenport reveals that by pressing a button on the band, medical experts will rock up to the compound in 20 minutes should he need any medical help, which includes mental health help. I was impressed with how Mamadou Atia acted in this scene, and I'll let Past Joel explain.
If you're ever in trouble, press the button. We got medical professionals less than 20 minutes away. That includes mental health, too.
How progressive.
Like I said, Dan, we did a thorough background check. We'd be negligent if we didn't.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you might need a stool sample? Yeah? Blood? Urine? I don't know. Maybe you got a fucking Rorschach test in the back there for me?
You got a clean bill of health, Dan.
Yeah.
Your breakdown is in rearview mirror as far as we're concerned. Just want you to know that we're here for you should you need us.
Cool.
I'll leave you to it.
Okay.
I like the acting choices that Mamadou made there. That's really cool. That's very realistic. I've only had an emotional breakdown, but like, if someone I don't know, if my new boss suddenly knows about that, I would be clamping up so much. Like, it was, like I say, it was just an emotional breakdown. It wasn't a mental breakdown. I didn't have to go to a mental health provider or anything like that. But like, if that happened, I would be like, sorry, what? I'm really uncomfortable now. Like, so he clamped up really well. That was really good acting choices, I think.
With nothing else to do and still feeling quite restless, Dan decides to head to the Archive 81 shelves to grab the next tape in the archive to restore, though he is briefly distracted by another archive room filled with numerous shelves full of VHS tapes. This will be relevant later. Oh yeah, and before I continue with the recap, I must quickly acknowledge the wonderful soundtrack of the show by Ben Salisbury and Jeff Barrow, whose scoring credits include 2014's Ex Machina and 2018's Annihilation. The music of the show seamlessly blends that retro techno groove of the late 80s and early 90s with modern sensibilities that is able to suitably be used as a drone in the more spooky moments of the show. It's just perfect. But back to the recap. Dan quickly restores the tape, and tape 2 begins with Melody giving a more in-depth explanation as to what she's doing at the Vista apartment building. I'll let her explain herself.
It's March 11th, 1994, 10:32 a.m. This is day 1 of the oral history project on the Vista apartment building. According to the New York Public Library archives, it was built in either 1932 or in 1934, architect unknown. Basically, it looks exactly like a million other buildings in the city. Oh, that's okay. It was built on the ruins of a mansion that burned down in the 20s. It's a strange detail for a building like this.
Do pay attention to the person in glasses who opens the door during that section, as he'll be extremely important to the story later. The janitor of the Vista building, John Smith, interrupts Melody's exposition dump, and he gives her a quick tour of the Vista, general housekeeping rules such as the 6th floor being off limits, as well as lead her to her apartment. She asks him about a Julia Bennett in her apartment, but he denies her of an answer, claiming a violation of privacy laws. Look, I barely know Australian privacy laws, so I have no idea what they're like in New York. Julia Bennett will come up multiple times in the series, so also keep track of that name. That night, Melody is woken by eerie, strange chanting. As the tension rises and the soundtrack intensifies, we hear huffed breaths within the haunting chants that is even effective in reeling in Dan closer and closer as he tries to work out what is specifically said in the chanting by turning up the volume of the playback before the chanting suddenly stops. All is deadly silent as the playback starts to flicker before a high-pitched, diegetically loud screeching noise screams out of the speakers, hurting Dan's ears and jump scaring him. But for the viewers, thankfully the sequence has been edited to not be a proper jump scare. This is actually another big plus for me as someone who does love horror. Surprisingly, I despise jump scares, especially ones that are accompanied by an ear-splitting, usually non-diegetic sound effect. Jump scares like those are cheap and overly relied upon in modern horror cinema, though the show does utilize the stereotypical sequence of quiet build-up to eerie silence to loud sound. The show makes sure that the loud climaxes are never too loud to startle the viewers into a superficial jump scare. Past Joel does get into more detail about this topic, but let's move on with the events of tape 2. The footage cuts to the next day as Melody struggles to get anybody to speak to her. Melody sees a girl walking through the hallways and easily interacts with the residents, and so Melody introduces herself to the girl. The girl's name is Jess, and Jess explains that she gets paid to run errands for several tenants of the building. After Melody offers to pay Jess for her assistance, the tape cuts to Melody's interview with a Tamara Stefano. Stefano. I don't know how to say it. A strange character who composes operas. Keep note that almost, if not all, the residents of the Vissa are quite strange. Tamara plays a sample of the current opera she's working on, and Melody recognizes the tune as the same melody as the chanting that woke her up in the previous night, though Tamara claims ignorance. Almost as if reacting to the proximity of the source of the chanting, Melody starts to feel physically ill and collapses, knocking over her camera. Back in the compound studio, Dan involuntarily starts to hum the same tune as he recognizes it. Reaching Mark's voicemail with the landline, Dan asks Mark to look into Tamara Stefano, only for the line to suddenly cut, and Dan immediately suspects the line to be monitored. That night, Virgil calls Dan to check up on him, and while exploring the shelves in the compound's recreative area, Dan finds a notebook filled with handwritten notes of soap opera plots. Let's put a pin on that too. After having dinner, Dan finds a rat and sets up multiple traps all around the compound to kill it. This doesn't end up working though, as after a night of restless sleep, Dan finds that the rat had managed to only have its tail be caught in the traps. Not being able to go through with killing the rat, Dan decides to bandage its tail and keep it impulsively as a pet of some sort. Everyone, meet Ratty, Dan's only conversation partner in the compound for a while. Tape 3 starts off after where tape 2 ended. Melody and Jess are now back in Jess's and her mother's apartment after leaving Tamara's. Jess gives Melody some snacks, believing her prior collapse to have something to do with low blood sugar or something similar. It's not. This interview with Jess serves as character building for Jess and the start of an innocent friendship between Jess and Melody, though the interview does take a turn when Jess starts to get all cryptic and mentions another character, Samuel, before this happens to her.
Jess, are you okay?
Jess collapses and the playback starts to glitch, similar to the audio glitch in tape 2, only this time there seems to be some sort of figure turning to face Dan from within the static and lunge at him. Dan runs outside and manages to find a small patch of mobile reception within the area of the compound and calls Mark. Dan starts to tell Mark about the seemingly supernatural figure he just saw, but fearing the possibility of sounding crazy, decides against it, instead asking Mark if the latter has managed to find anything about Tamara. Unfortunately, nothing about the opera composer, so Dan asks Mark to look into LMG and Melody Pendris instead. After hanging up, as Dan tries to mark the spot with the okay mobile reception, we see a figure dressed in red watching him from a distance. This was an excellent reveal, and I loved how they filmed the sequence. Instead of the random snippets of memories we saw earlier in the episode, we get the first proper glimpse of Dan's past when we're transported to a time where his sister is playing the familiar tune of the chanting. This causes their father, Stephen Turner, to freak out when Dan's sister reveals that she heard the tune from the tapes. Young Dan is then instructed to take the family dog, Cleo, out on a walk ultimately saving Dan from dying in the house fire that killed the rest of the family that night. When Dan returns to the studio in present day, he finds that tape 3 has gotten all mixed up once more in the tape player and is forced to refix the tape once more, and once again, he puts it on to continue watching the tape. This time around though, at the point where the tape originally started to glitch, it simply cuts back to Jess after her episode. Melody tries to find out more information about what had just happened, believing it to be a seizure. Jess mentions a Father Russo who believes that Jess is instead possessed, before Jess asks Melody if there could be another world besides this one. And I just have to say as well, the girl playing Jess, Ariana Neal, is a wonderful actor. She hasn't been in much, Archive 81 being her first credit as part of the main cast, but she's someone who will probably make it big in the future as an actor. Almost desperate to leave the squalor of the Vista, Jess asks Melody this odd question.
Do you believe there's another world besides this one?
You mean like heaven and hell?
No, I mean like this one, but different.
Do you think I could be more than I am? Like, do I seem strong enough to hold a new world inside of me?
The hurt and vulnerability portrayed in Jess's eyes might distract you from the strange question, but I picked up on it on my first viewing, and so should you. Remember, everything leads to something in this show. The contents of tape 3 suddenly cut to an extended version of the cold open. Melody is in the Vis's stairwell as she tells the camera that a mysterious they took Jess. She's then seen rushing up the stairs, only to be stopped by John Smith, who reprimands her and says that the building's 6th floor is off limits. Melody accuses John Smith of kidnapping Jess before he blocks the stairwell and forces her to go back down, as she desperately calls out Jess's name. She turns around only to be stopped by the same guy who exited the front of the Vista at the start of tape 2. This man tells Melody that Jess is gone, but Melody is having none of it. The tape glitches and we then get to see two strangers who seem to be looking for Melody. She begs to the viewer of the tape to find her as these two strangers forcibly grab her, and right before the tape ends, a familiar face approaches her to calm her down. As tape 3 ends, to our shock and Dan's bewilderment, the familiar face approaching Melody was none other than Dan's own father, Stephen. The episode ends with footage of Dan in the studio amongst several other cameras that have been set up all around the bunker and a silent Virgil Davenport watching over Dan hyperventilating. Episode 2, Wellspring. The cold open for this episode is a TV spot for a company named Wellspring. More on Wellspring later, but it's essentially Ancestry.com/MyHeritage, but with a whole lot more sus. But let's go through the episode. After the reveal of his father in Melody's Vista footage, Dan is frantically ringing and waking Mark up. At the mention of Dan's father, Mark is quickly invested, and Dan asks Mark to go grab his father's old files when he used to be a psychologist and a psychology professor at NYU. Good friend Mark agrees without a complaint. Without anything else to do, and not able to get any sleep anytime soon, Dan goes straight into the archive and grabs another tape to restore. In tape 4, Melody accompanies Jess on one of her errand runs for the Vista tenants. They visit a hardware store, and there, Father Russo approaches Jess and says hi. Jess awkwardly introduces the father to Melody. The two later visit an electronics store where Jess collects her own camera. More on the camera later, but here we're informed that Jess also likes to make little home movies, and we see where she keeps the camera hidden to keep it a secret from her mum. As Jess and Melody make their way to the different tenants, Jess introduces Melody to Cassandra Wall, an old woman who lives in the Vista. Cassandra invites Jess up to tea as the girl suggests letting Melody interview her, but instead of answering Jess's suggestion, the old woman instead acts all creepy in a way that made me extremely uncomfortable.
Oh, yuck. Oh, no, 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 no.
But no point in lingering over awkward interactions. In the next scene, Jess easily introduces Melody to another Vista tenant, psychic extraordinaire, Beatriz Reyes. Beatriz is friendly and introduces herself and tells Melody her journey to living in the Vista in front of the camera and proceeds to give Melody a free tarot reading. Beatrice warns Melody of the strangeness of the other residents of the building and how there is apparently a sex club. Let's let Beatrice do her reading in peace.
Past, present, future. Grief, pain. You've suffered as a child. There's something hidden. Something that has guided you to this place. Someone. Don't take it literally. Death has many meanings.
From the first two cards, we quickly get a sense that Beatrice isn't a fake. She seems to be connected spiritually and is quite accurate to her reading of Melody's situation. That's why, even after she assures Melody that the death card has many meanings, there's still a sense of dread hanging in the air. During the interview at Melody's question about Julia Bennett, Beatrice mentions the apartment 4G and how there used to be a woman who lived there. This being the only lead Melody has right then of Julia Bennett brings her to the building's mailboxes as she sees 4G's mailbox being extremely full. Melody is caught trying to take some mail out of 4G's mailbox by the most charming, creepy guy you would ever meet, Samuel. In order to befriend Melody, Samuel mentions how a nephew of his gifted him with a skeleton key, a key with the supposed ability of unlocking any lock. Since Melody still seems awkward to him, he mentions how Tamara is rallying an audience to watch a showcase of a new opera on stage in a bar nearby, and Melody agrees to meet him later to accompany him in watching the showcase. The footage cuts, and we get a small montage of Melody trying out different outfits for her date with Samuel that night. Okay, it's here that I have to mention one change that the show makes that is kind of interesting. And I don't believe that the change makes the show better or worse. It's just an interesting one. And that is, in the podcast, Melody is implied to at least be bisexual, though co-creator Mark Solinger officially revealed she's a lesbian. According to the wiki, something I've been looking at for information every now and then as I write this script, during the events of the Visa, Melody was in fact dating a girl named Alexa, and upon further research, it seems that the character Alexa was ultimately changed to Annabelle, and their relationship of significant other, girlfriend to wife in the podcast, was downgraded to simply best friend. Now, in later episodes, when we see more of Annabelle's and Melody's friendship, it could be interpreted as very flirty at times. So with a lot of allowances, the most you could say about TV Melody is that she could be bisexual, but it's never explored, as she quickly develops a crush for Samuel in this episode that thankfully does not last for long, before developing something more of an innocent dependence with Dan that we'll also see later in the series. It's all a shame though, as the change seems kinda superficial, and I guess, and this is pure conjecture on my part, the fact that Melody does end up getting this quick tiny crush on Samuel in this episode was an attempt to make Samuel seem more charming. Overall, like I said in my SG1 video, I'm all for the artist or creator getting the last word on their artwork / creation. However, unlike MGM's decision for SG1, changing a main character's sexuality that was originally a big part of their characterization and motivation in the podcast seems to be a real big shame here. As I previously mentioned, there is a little bit of bi energy on display in the Netflix show in the scenes with Annabelle, so maybe if the show had gotten a second season, there might have been a chance to explore that aspect of Melody's character. But anyway, let's move on. Melody gets a phone call that goes to her answering machine as she's deciding what to wear, and it's from Dan's father, Stephen. She quickly deletes the message. We cut to outside again, but while looking for some reception, Dan notices an abandoned looking shack on the compound property that he never noticed before. Though the building is locked, Dan is able to find a ladder nearby that he uses to leverage some height and receive some reception for his mobile phone and calls Mark. It goes to Mark's answering machine this time, so Dan simply relays the new information that he's just found out about Melody and implores his friend to hurry with retrieving his dad's old files. The same red figure is seen in the background of the shot, and when Dan hangs up, he also notices the figure and gives chase. To de-stress over the hectic events of the day, as he's drinking some totally not product placement advertising Heineken, he voices his theory of LMG's true identity as a conglomerate to Ratty. This is a funny scene and is the most accurate to podcast depiction of Dan and Ratty in the whole series, though the contents of this scene do come back later, so keep that in mind.
What if LMG is some massive board game conglomerate? Maybe we're part of some fucked up board game beta test? You know? The Visitor? Restored tape. Move 6 spaces. Spot a potential serial killer in a red jacket. Go straight to jail. Do not collect $100,000.
While looking through the shelves of assorted media, Dan notices a VHS of The Secret of Nim, something that he noticed Melody talk about earlier in one of the Vista tapes. It wasn't too important, so I didn't mention it then. He decides to watch it. However, during the movie, Dan gets a vision of his dad in the TV screen reflection wearing a red jacket, silently mouthing words. We never get to find out what is actually said by this vision of Steven, but from watching the scene over and over again, it looks to me that Vision Steven, Vativan? No, that's terrible. It seems to me that the Vision is saying something along the lines of, listen to me, you need to stop. The Vision turns around and walks away from Dan, and Dan follows suit, though he quickly loses Vision Steven. In a sequence that reminded me of that one sequence in Haunting of Hill House, you know, the one in the episode 2 Storms, Dan finds himself deep in the bowels of the compound property, only for it to morph into kinda looking like the Vista hallways as he stops in front of a door labeled 2D and knocks on it. He hears a female voice beyond the door asking who's there, and after a short silence, Melody opens the door. Suddenly Dan wakes up on the couch and believes everything prior to be a dream. Like Dan at this moment, let's move on to the next tape. Tape 5 starts with Melody approaching the bar that night. At the bar, she approaches Tamara, who simply studies her and then chuckles before leaving Melody to awkwardly mull over the interaction. Samuel approaches her and is amused at how Melody brings the camera seemingly everywhere before the footage cuts ankle deep into the showcase of the first act of Tamara's opera. Note the masks the actors use on stage. Once again, the opera's soundtrack seems to disagree with Melody physically, and she is saved by Samuel, who suggests that they leave the showcase and retreat back to the now quieter bar. We and Melody find out more about Samuel, about how he's a teacher at Columbia University teaching Renaissance and medieval studies, whilst translating ancient poetry as a side gig to keep himself afloat. The two actors do seem to have pretty good chemistry together, and the vulnerability that Samuel displays in this scene works wonders in offsetting the initial weirdness that we first got of the character. That vulnerability is reciprocated by Melody when she reveals to him and us that her adopted mother was a filmmaker and that she died 2 years prior to the events of the series. Biting the bullet, Melody straight up asks Samuel about the sex club allegations that Beatrice raised early in the day. Claim that Samuel quickly denies and explains that the group instead is something called the Vista Historical Society. Look, let's cut to the chase right now. The Vista Historical Society is a cult, and Samuel is its leader. But this isn't the reveal episode yet, so more on that later, I guess. Melody asks Samuel if he or anybody at the Historical Society knew of a Julia Bennett, but unfortunately, it's a dead end for Melody. We cut to the front of the Vista building, and Samuel ends up giving Melody the skeleton key he mentioned earlier in the day. And partly because they're both tipsy, and partly because they're both attractive, and this is a TV show, Melody and Samuel kiss. Go back to my little tangent about Melody's sexuality change to know how I feel about this development. He goes to buy some more liquor for a nightcap, wink wink nudge nudge, and Melody rushes to the mailboxes. She uses the skeleton key to unlock 4G's mailbox, only to find out it's now completely empty. Going back to her apartment, Melody is surprised to find that her roommate and best friend, Annabelle, is there. Annabelle is played by Julia Chan and is another actor who seemed to be perfect for their role in the show. Also, in this scene, we finally find out that Steven was Melody's therapist, so the plot thickens. Samuel appears at the door and slightly awkward at there being one more woman in Melody's apartment that he emotionally prepared for. He calls for a rain check for the nightcap and leaves before the tape ends. Oh, and something that I haven't mentioned yet as well. Throughout the episode in Dan's timeline, we've seen Ratty slowly but surely make a bigger mess as the rat gets hold of more and more paper towels and the like. And when Dan goes to get cleaning supplies in a cabinet, he realizes that the plaster at the back of the cabinet is quite thin. Impromptu renovation time. After making a hole big enough to go through, Dan finds hidden hallways throughout the whole compound and explores the dark hallways to find a lower ground floor of locked rooms. One is filled with folders that have Wellspring labeled on them, and further exploring the hallways, he finds that it's connected to the inside of the abandoned building he found outside earlier. The building is in fact an abandoned chapel filled with multiple empty pews and even like a large crucifix model that might have hung up on the wall at one point. On the back of one of the pews, Dan finds carved initials TB plus AF. Dan is soon confronted by bossman Davenport, who got there real quick smart and explains how his family used to be religious and how his views differed to theirs quite drastically. Davenport stresses that he doesn't want to fire Dan for trespassing into off-limit areas, but Dan knows Davenport won't hire him since he's sure that the latter knew that Steven is on the Vista tapes. And this is where we finally get some exposition on Wellspring, so I'll let Davenport explain.
Come on down, Dan. This time you're invited. I insist. Come on. I started Wellspring back in 2006. built it up into a nice little business before the competition sprung up. I thought, what a gift, giving people the opportunity to know who they really are. Then all those law enforcement agencies wanted to get their mitts on the information. What right did they have to turn it all rotten? So I closed up shop. I take privacy very seriously.
It seems that it's through Wellspring that Davenport came to know a lot about Dan's past, and in one of the folders, we also get to see a physical and slightly burnt picture of Melody and Cleo, the picture that originally convinced Dan to accept the restoration job. Davenport assures Dan that he doesn't know what's on the tape, and reveals to the latter that Stephen seemed to have had a breakdown of some sorts, which Dan finds hard to believe, but Davenport shows him a notice of temporary leave that NYU sent to Stephen, citing a breach of an Article 6D. As Davenport leaves, he reiterates that if Dan was caught snooping around off-limits areas one more time, then he would be fired, and that he shouldn't stay cooped up in the compound. The man mentions a town 14 miles south of the compound's location that seems to have a cafe with good coffee. As Davenport walks away, he reminisces about how Dan and him are both alike in the fact that they like solving mysteries, and that they both would have been pretty good at inventing board game. I told you to keep that seemingly inconsequential scene in mind. Dan goes straight into recovering tape 6. Tape 6 begins seemingly that same night as Melody hears the creepy chanting again. She attempts to wake Annabelle, but to no avail. Instead, Melody decides to follow the chanting down to the stairwell, to the community room, where she hears a woman speaking in an unknown language over some speakers. It's here that I believe the word K-Lego is first heard. More on that word later. Sneaking inside the community room, we see a large number of people, all Vista residents, sitting and chanting the familiar creepy tune. Among those present that we see are Cassandra, Tamara, and Samuel. Melody also manages to record a creepy stone figure in a cabinet/altar at the far end of the room that the chanting residents are facing towards. Melody quickly hides in a wardrobe of some sort as the chanting seems to have finished, and once she is confident that everyone has left the room, she exits the wardrobe. The cabinet/altar is still in the room, though it is now locked shut. Hearing some noise coming from another entrance to the community room, Melody hides once more and is able to secretly record Tamara and Samuel entering the community room once more before Samuel re-enters Tamara. We find out later that the two characters used to date, but I kind of like this joke, so I kept it in. As the coupling of the two characters continue, they gradually get rougher and rougher, and once again, the tape seems to glitch out, and a loud, high-pitched noise startles Dan and forces him to turn down the volume of the playback again. This time, interestingly though, the lights in the studio seems to also be affected during this strange occurrence. The tape cuts to when Melody returns to her apartment, and she accidentally wakes Annabelle up. Melody struggles to explain to Annabelle what she just witnessed, but seeing the distress in her best friend, Annabelle suggests that the two leave that night. Unfortunately, Melody isn't ready to leave, and she reveals to Annabelle the reason why she's at the Vista in the first place, and that was to look for Julia Bennett, her birth mother. Seeing how much this means for her best friend, Annabelle decides to stay at the Vista with Melody to help her find out more information about her birth mother. If only she knew the gravity of her decision at that moment. A knock at her door interrupts this lovely interaction between the two, and Melody calls out who's there, and wait a minute, I'm getting a strong sense of deja vu here. That's right, all this time that we thought it was all in Dan's dream, we and Dan get physical proof that on some level in that very moment, Dan and Melody had somehow contacted each other, as the camera captures the moment Melody hears the knock at the door, but when she answers the door, she mentions that the hallway was empty before tape 6 ends. Realizing that there's more that connects Dan with Melody than just his father, Dan decides to make the ride down to the town that Davenport mentioned. Now out of the eye-full watch of Davenport and LMG, Dan meets with Mark, who has brought with him Stephen's old tapes of his appointments with Melody. Dan had recorded himself playing the tune that's been appearing in the Visa tapes and shows it to Mark, explaining that somehow he and his sister had heard the tune when they were younger. Dan asks Mark to investigate the tune and see if there's any information on it online. He also asks Mark to investigate the word K-Lego. As they exchange information, Mark relays to Dan what he's learned about LMG, so I'll let him explain that.
So, basically, Legacy Management Global is an iceberg, or a fucking Russian nesting doll. Pick your metaphor. My dad's got a subscription to every corporate research database out there. I'm sure I didn't find half the shit they're tied up with.
Real estate?
Real estate, defense, media, biotech, and fucking synthetic gemstone manufacturing. Wellspring never even showed up, which means it's probably an offshoot of an offshoot.
The episode ends with Mark's final reveal that Melody Pendris didn't die in the Vista fire, but is in fact living in Pittsburgh. Episode 3, Terror in the Isles. The episode starts as Dan is listening to one of his father's tapes with Melody. We finally get a glimpse into Melody's past after she was abandoned by her birth mother. Melody explains how she grew up in a religious orphanage and was described by the nuns there as a strange kid. Strange in this case seems to be acts like she's possessed and scrawling dark, ominous pictures everywhere. When she was questioned as a child about her drawings, she would mention the other place. This language is reminiscent of Jess's interview in the previous episode. At the appointment, Stephen is looking at examples of Melody's old scribblings and attempts to provide Melody with logical reasons as to why she may have acted that way when she was younger and is now having problems in her adult life. At the end of her appointment, Stephen introduces Melody to Cleo, and this gives us the answer to how there is a photo of Cleo with Melody, as it seems to be something Stephen did a lot for his patients. At the end of the tape, Stephen mentions that it was recorded on February 24th, 1993, which is approximately just over a year before Melody would step into the visa. Outside, standing near the Lock Chapel building, Dan checks up on Mark, who has found out about Article 6D. I'll let Mark describe the situation.
Article 6D in the department guidelines, faculty members are prohibited from publishing material that would affect the reputation, community, or educational standing of NYU. Remember that musicologist I used to date, the one with the divorce jack tattoo? I sent your mystery tune to her. She never heard anything like it. And unless they're saying the name of some flying lemur in Southeast Asia, I still got nothing on Kalego.
As they exchange information, Dan reveals he's been very productive, managing to locate and map out all the cameras located all over the compound to find its blind spots. And he has also managed to hijack into the surveillance feed and now has access to the footage. Mark is on his way to meet with the still alive Melody, and the two friends end their call. Dan heads into his bathroom, one of the few locations that Davenport thankfully did not place any cameras in, turns on the shower for cover, and works out that the interior of the chapel is also a place with no cameras. While he's concentrating, Dan suddenly finds himself transported into the community room of the Vista in 1994, and Melody is also there. What's an even bigger surprise is that unlike the knocking at the door in the previous episode, Melody reacts to Dan as if he's physically there. Dan struggles to wrap his mind around what's currently happening, but is able to introduce himself to Melody. Melody invites him out to a drink, a coffee, or at the very least to share a pineapple Fanta, when they both hear a knocking at the door that snaps Dan back into his present day. Oh, and I forgot to mention that due to the fact that present day characters mentioned the Visa fire happening 25 years prior, the present day timeline is occurring in 2019. Using his access to the surveillance feed, Dan sees that a figure wearing a red jacket is standing outside the bathroom door. When asked for their identity, the woman introduces herself as Bobby, a housekeeper for the compound who works for LMG. She explains that the shower water had been running for a long time, and fearing a health crisis, Davenport had sent Bobby to check in on Dan, just in case. Triggered by the lack of privacy and the weird-ass time-traveling shenanigans he just experienced, Dan sends the older woman away and goes straight to repairing another tape. Tape 7 begins the morning after the events of the previous tape. In the community room, Annabelle is holding the camera while Melody explained to the camera and Annabelle what she witnessed but didn't get the chance to capture on tape. Melody remembers the recording of the woman's voice coming from the cassette player present in the room, but obviously the tapes had been taken out the night prior. Annabelle suggests Melody ask Jess about the cult meetings, but Melody is protective of Jess, seeing the girl as someone similar to her younger self and vows to protect her from anything cultish. Cassandra enters the community room, seemingly not noticing the two friends in there with her, and casually posts up a notice for a canasta tournament. Once she notices Annabelle, she seems to be drawn in by the younger woman, and when Melody asks the older woman about her attendance of the cult meeting the night prior, Cassandra feigns ignorance. The older woman quickly leaves the room, and the tape cuts to Melody visiting Jess in the girl's apartment. Jess seems depressed, and after pressing a little, the girl finally tells Melody that she got into a fight in school because of some bullies who made fun of her seizures. Kids can be such little shits. Since Erica, Jess's mother, is Catholic, she believes that the seizures are from something supernatural and has gotten Father Russo to help her daughter. Jess wants to get better, but according to the girl, Father Russo would guilt trip her and say that she's not trying hard enough. Not trying hard enough of what? To have faith, Jess explains. What a wanker. Hearing that little girl's experience almost immediately triggers Melody of what her childhood was like. She offers to take Jess to see Stephen Turner, not for a proper psychologist appointment, but to have a chat. Even if the two had a falling out of some sorts in between the appointment Dan listened to and Melody heading into the Visa, he still helped her. and we'll find out what that falling out was about soon. Melody mentions on the tape that she's taking Jess to see Steven that Saturday morning, and Dan races to look for his father's note-keeping tapes and plays the tape of the appointment. During the appointment, Jess explains that she's had the seizures for almost her whole life. The burden and pain on her face when she mentions that everybody that she knows claims it's all in her head is heartbreaking to see. Steven questions further in an attempt to understand what Jess is experiencing exactly, and Jess uses similar pulling language that she mentioned in early episodes with Melody, as well as how Melody explained it earlier to Steven himself earlier in this episode. The show makes it obvious that the two characters are connected somehow, and Steven seems to also note the similarities. As Steven closes out the appointment, Cleo comes to visit the office once again, and while the girl is out, Steven and Melody discuss Jess. Steven is being professional, revealing that her episodes could still be a number of different logical, natural things, and the only way for him to be sure is to get a full neurological workup, though to do that he needs a written parental consent. This is where we find out that the falling out that Steven and Melody had was about whether or not Melody should look for her birth mother. Steven believed that Melody might not be strong enough emotionally, while Melody was adamant about finding the elusive woman who abandoned her. Suddenly, Erica storms into Steven's office and berates Melody for bringing Jess to the psychologist. Turns out, Jess had lied about getting a permission from her mother, and when Jess and Erica leave, there's this weird interaction between Melody and Steven, and past Joel had a lot of thoughts about it, so I'll let him share right now.
I mean, I'd be upset too, Melody. You can't parent other people's kids.
She got
I
told.
used to pray that someone would come and parent me.
Jess told her that it was okay. It's not her fault. Why? Steven, excuse me.
With the end of his father's tape, Dan glances at the surveillance feeds and notices Bonnie standing over the tape deck in the compound studio watching the contents of tape 7 that he left on playback. Past Joel, watching this sequence for the first time around, found the whole interaction odd and creepy. It's safe to say that his theories about who Bonnie might be in the First Impressions videos are thrown completely off by this interpretation of the scene. But looking at it a second time to write the script, I can definitely see that whatever Bonnie saw on the tape that she had access to made her slightly emotional. It's very subtle and small, and the way the scene is shot makes it slightly difficult to see her face clearly, but watching the scene the second time around, I believe I can see her eyes being kind of red. She seems to be taken aback by the footage, and that's why she's all emotional. But let's hold on to this knowledge in the back of our minds for now though. Before the woman leaves, Dan does get her to unlock the chapel for him, and she leaves to do so without saying a word. The show cuts to Mark as he visits present-day Melody. She quickly debunks everything depicted on the Vista tapes as not real, even mentioning the Blair Witch Project as a suitable contemporary of the contents of the Vista tape. She reveals to Mark that she doesn't remember much of the night of the fire, only waking up once in her Vista apartment to see everything on fire, including her own body, before waking back up in the hospital and listed as a Jane Doe. Another thing I realized when watching the show the second time is that it seems like Mark started to doubt whether or not the woman he's talking to is the real Melody Pendris pretty quickly. This is something that past Joe completely missed when he was recording the First Impressions video on this episode. As a reminder, if you would like to see the unedited recordings of me watching the shows, mostly for the first time, and give my legitimately first impressions on them, just head over to my Patreon, link in the description, and become a paid member where you get all 8 First Impressions videos for the Netflix show, as well as other exclusive behind-the-scenes goodies. But back to Mark's deductive reasoning. At this point, after sharing all the information with Dan, we could safely assume that Mark knows that Annabelle has started to stay at the Vista with Melody, and so the fact that the woman in front of him had not mentioned her seemingly best friend once in her testimony was kind of a red flag. The second strike seems to be the woman's usage of the amnesia card when he questions her about Stephen Turner, and the final strike seemed to be when he played Dan's recording of the mystery tune. The woman seems to be unaffected by the melody and describes the tune as pretty to Mark. But we cut back to the compound as Dan reminisces about Cleo to Ratty as he's repairing tape 8. Lost in the moment for a split second, he accidentally breaks the tape casing and needs to go downstairs to get a replacement. While he goes downstairs, he is seamlessly transported to the familiar Vista stairwell and sees Melody sitting on a step below him, writing notes in a journal. She seems to be on a bad mental health day, which heavily implies that this stairwell meeting happened, in her perspective, sometime after accompanying Jess to the Saturday appointment, and so Dan decides to make Melody feel better by encouraging her. I love the little programming metaphor Dan makes in this scene when he says it's a feature, not a bug. It's something that's quite easily and readily accepted for us now in this app-filled present day of 2024, but that kind of language in the early 90s is quite literally decades too early to be mainstream and understood as a colloquialism. When the phrase is repeated later in the series, we see how out of place the quote is, and yet in this moment between the two leads, Melody understood the core meaning of what Dan is saying, and it creates this nice moment of real connection between the two of them. Dan wakes up in the studio. The tape casing seemingly never broke, and so he finishes repairing tape 8 and watches the footage. On the tape, Annabelle questions why Melody is going to church, and Melody explains that she plans on meeting Father Russo to try and get him to get Jess some real help. Cutting to the church, we get seemingly every other portrayal of church in all media. A sermon about the temptations of the devil, and how to be vigilant in seeing the devil in all his forms, all that good fear-mongering stuff. All of this is where the connection to the episode's cold open comes in, as Father Russo, well, he practically subtweets about the in-universe newly released film Satan's Carnival that was featured in the segment of Terror in the Isles in the cold open. What's the church sermon version of a subtweet though? Like, sub-preach? After the service, Father Russo allows Melody to film an interview with him. While setting up the camera and waiting for the father, Melody notices a massive locked cabinet in his office. Father Russo enters his office and Melody wonders about the locked cabinet. She plays off the question as a joke, but he provides her with a somber and serious answer.
What's hiding in there? Set of Nancy Drew, Thornbirds.
You'd be surprised how many forbidden texts the church keeps in its vaults. Books with dark secrets from all over the world. Grimoires, occult keys. There is great power in knowing your enemy.
The interview with Father Russo provides further context and character building on Russo himself, though I find it quite interesting that unlike all the other previous interview scenes with the Vista tenants, with mostly close-up shots, half of this scene was shot as long shots. For the first half of the interview, as Melody is still unsure about Russo as a person, there's always a constant distance portrayed on screen between Russo and Melody, and it's not until Father Russo questions Melody about her not taking the Eucharist or communion, that as Melody feels comfortable enough to open up a little to the religious man, that the shots transition to the usual close-up interview shots. Just some really nice visual media observations that I had watching the show, so that this whole video isn't just a surface-level recap of a show that brings nothing new of substance to the table. Father Russo approaches the subject of the vista before the interview is cut short when they both hear Erica's terrified screams for help. In the hallway, Jess is suffering from another seizure and Russo rushes to help the girl. Luckily, Jess's episode quickly ends. The footage then cuts to Melody and Annabelle in the shop she mentioned to Dan previously in the stairwell. She's currently buying items for a care hamper for Jess. Annabelle is still unsure if Melody should insert herself in the private affairs of a stranger, but Melody defends her caring nature by repeating Dan's feature not bug line. Confusing, Annabelle.
It's a feature, not a bug.
What the fuck does that mean?
This is the first proof for Dan that his and Melody's rendezvous conversations with each other hadn't just only been a dream, and he is understandably shocked. In this scene, we also find out that Cassandra is quite loaded and is an art collector, and that Annabelle is an artist. More focus is put on Cassandra in the next episode, so let's keep going. The footage cuts to Melody approaching Jess's and Erica's apartment. The TV is blasting inside the apartment, and nobody seems to answer the door when Melody knocks. Tamara exits her neighboring apartment, complaining about how loud Father Russo leaves the TV when he visits Jess and Erica's apartment, and fearing the worst stemming from her own trauma of growing up in a Catholic institution, Melody orders Tamara to grab the spare key to Jess's apartment, and when they finally get inside, Father Russo seems to be in the middle of a scuffed exorcism ritual, though it looks frighteningly like he's about to waterboard the little girl. All of a sudden, with an authority that seems unnatural, Samuel barges into the apartment with John Smith, and the father is escorted out by the latter. Samuel comforts Jess and begs to Erica to let him get some real help for Jess, as he has contacts at Columbia who are experts at pediatric neurology. Erica finally relents as Melody approaches the father in the hallway to berate his actions. He warns her that something sinister is happening within the vista and that Melody should leave while she still could before the tape ends. Dan calls Mark for an update, and at first, to protect his best friend, the latter lies about not being able to meet with present-day Melody. Dan is understanding and reveals that he asked Bobby to open up the chapel because it has an unmonitored entrance to the secret lower levels of the compound, and that he's recorded 7 hours of empty corridor footage to loop back into the surveillance feed so that he could snoop without Davenport knowing. All that's left for Dan to do is to figure out the code to get back into the archives. Mark then apologizes for lying to Dan and reveals that the woman he spoke to was not Melody, but in fact just a random woman who bought Melody's identity and collects Melody's disability and unemployment payments. And the two friends quickly end their call afterwards. With his biggest lead turning out to be a massive dead end, and without anything else to do, Dan decides to rewind tape 8 and watch it from the beginning. Dan pauses the playback when Melody mentions the featured not bug line again, and the playback glitches and suddenly the footage of the tape seems to be playing again. Only this time Melody is on the playback screen acknowledging Dan watching her and greets him. She shows the can of pineapple Fanta on the playback and thanks Dan for his kind, supportive words, saying that she needed to hear them. Dan, who's genuinely confused at the fact that he's currently somehow having a conversation with someone on tape, asks if what he's witnessing is real, and Melody is oblivious to the supernatural nature of their conversation. Melody reacts to distant sounds of Annabelle seemingly arguing with someone unseen, and Melody apologizes to Dan and promises to return before exiting the store through the entrance visible in the background of the footage, leaving Dan in stunned silence. As the tape continues to mysteriously play but not play, Dan watches silently as Cassandra enters the store and stands in the same spot Melody had stood moments prior. She seems to look around for something before her eyes lock onto the camera and straight down the barrel into Dan's eyes, and with a low menacing voice she growls at Dan to stay out before snatching out her arm and grabbing Dan's throat. Dan wakes up with a start in bed and the episode cuts to black. And this is how Past Joe reacted to this particular cliffhanger.
Is she gonna try and break out of the screen?
Stay out.
Oh! Oh, dude! Oh, freaking hell, man! Oh, so... my... Holy crap.
Episode 4. Spirit Receivers. I have to mention this episode has a painting with breasts on it. The YouTube version of this video will be YouTube safe, so don't worry about it. YouTube, please. The cold open for this episode comes in the form of an ad listing several artworks made by an artist named Eleanor Wall. Other pieces have been collected by Eleanor's sister, Cassandra. After the opening credits, the show jumps straight into Dan dealing with the ending of the previous episode with his nightmare. The show makes an effort to know that he is, in fact, still taking his medication, though he's still quite haunted by the dream. We then see him attempting to brute force the code to the locked archives, only for nothing to work and ultimately giving up for now. The quick shot of him crossing out different, most likely used codes that was searched up on the internet shows that it's a 5-digit code, and after quickly looking up the maths for the probability of stumbling upon a code like that, Google says that there's over 90,000 different combinations to try, so you can safely assume that it'll take a while. When Dan steps outside, it's now snowing around the compound area, no characters mention it, and no camera shots dwell on it. It's just a nice subtle way to show the passage of time. It was obviously autumn or fall for the Americans, and was possibly right at the tail end of autumn at the start of the series when Dan arrived at the compound, and now it seems to be winter. From what is shown on screen as the audience, we know that Dan has spent at least 5 days at the compound, but the snow creates a sense of uncertainty in us that maybe Dan has been at the compound for much longer. Dan calls Mark while he's outside, but only receives the latter's voicemail. He asks Mark to help him find out how to hack into the code lock, as he's had no luck so far. As Dan starts to walk back to the compound, a vision of Melody appears in front of him. At first he's shocked and asks her how she got there, and she appears to be equally confused as she seems to react to finding herself in the middle of the woods. Suddenly Bonnie calls out to him and he snaps out of his trance only to find that it's now nighttime. A whole day has been wasted, further accentuating the uncertain passage of time experienced in the compound. Excusing himself and returning back to the compound, Dan gets a phone call from Davenport, who tells him a story about his first job as a paper delivery boy. The point of the story was meant to emphasize on the importance of routine, and notes that Dan didn't digitize any new footage from the visit tapes that day. Ignoring Davenport's feigned worry of his mental health, Dan goes straight to working out of office hours and repairing tape 9. The The tape begins with Melody visiting Jess a few days after the events of Tape 8. During that time, it seems that Samuel's colleagues have come and suggested ways to help Jess with her seizures, and the girl is now rebounding quite well. Feeling super productive and wanting to earn some extra credits for science class, Jess shows the homework that she's currently working on, writing about the comet Charon. A quick look on Google about Comet Charon and all you'll get are links and articles about Archive 81. Comet Charon isn't a real comet. The name does come from the Greek deity Charon, who is the ferryman of souls, bringing them over the river Styx into the afterlife. Charon's a pretty cool character in Hades as well. Jess drops some exposition about the in-universe history of Comet Charon, how in the old days the comet was seen as mystical and of great spiritual importance, with songs being made and different cultures tracking its repeated appearances as it repeatedly streaks across the night sky. The comet's repeated skimming off of Earth's atmosphere has resulted in chunks breaking off and falling down to Earth, creating the mineral charonite. Jess casually mentions that Charon was going to be visible soon in a couple of weeks, and that Samuel had even bought her a telescope so that they could look at the comet. Isn't he such a good guy? Annabelle arrives to whisk Melody off to visit Cass's apartment, as the older woman has finally agreed to let Melody interview her. We finally get a look-see into Cassandra's apartment, and we realize that the location of the cold open is the interior of the apartment. We do get a closer look at some more items that were only quickly highlighted during the cold open, including the painting I mentioned at the beginning of this section. During Cassandra's interview / house tour, we find out that Eleanor discovered the visitor apartments and that the couple moved in 1974, as Eleanor believed the building to be very spiritual. In the corner of another room, Melody discovers a similar cabinet as the one that she saw in the community room. Unfortunately, this cabinet is locked, and Cassandra catches her as she investigates the cabinet. Melody tries to ask Cassandra about the cult once more, but before the older woman could answer properly, Annabelle grabs her attention when the latter asks the woman about the painting with the boobies. The most important things to note about this painting is that it's a portrait of Cassandra, painted by Eleanor, and the pendant on the painting is the same Charonite pendant that we've seen Cassandra wear all the time she's appeared on screen. Cassandra also reveals more about the episode's title, Spirit Receivers, and I'll let her explain it.
Who called themselves spirit receivers. They believed mysterious beings were speaking through them to manifest art and beauty and truth. You know, it really was something to watch her create. No idea what her brushstroke would reveal. No certainty of who or what she was communicating with. I can't begin to imagine the worlds which lie undiscovered. I only hope my Eleanor is waiting in one of them.
Is that the same pendant?
Yes. It's Charonite. They say it came from a comet.
Being an artist herself, Annabelle is drawn into the painting, and Cassandra mentions that Eleanor used to mix her own paint. That mention does remind the older woman about some leftover paint, and she grabs a jar of the homebrew from a nearby cupboard and gifts it to Annabelle. Annabelle then helps Melody in asking Cassandra if she remembers meeting a Julia Bennett who might have lived at the Vista. In the past 20 years, she's been a tenant, but Cassandra unfortunately does not remember. She does invite both Melody and Annabelle to a dinner party she's holding the following evening to thank a recent buyer, but also stating that there would be few long-term residents attending that might remember Julie Bennett. In the elevator, Annabelle explains to Melody that Eleanor had committed suicide by jumping into the Hudson River and drowning, and that's why the older woman seemingly acts odd, and as she probably still is not over her lover's tragic death. Standing by their apartment door, it's Samuel. The two parties share some polite pleasantries as Melody thanks the man for his actions to help Jess, and Samuel asks if he could have his skeleton key back. And while Melody steps inside to find the key, I'll just let it play out. It's a great scene.
Here's what I'm curious about. What's with the after-hours satanic choir practice?
I'm sorry?
The community room a couple nights ago, you and a bunch of friends singing all the songs that got cut from Jesus Christ Superstar. So Melody couldn't sleep and she went on a walkabout.
Yeah, Tamara was feeling, well, she didn't think that her performance went very well, and so she just wanted to try out some new material. So.
New material, right. Is that what the kids are calling it these days?
She's my ex, and we had too much of that terrible red wine that she drinks, and
It's fine. It doesn't matter.
Boy, Samuel's pretty good at reasoning, huh? This is when Melody finds out that Tamara was Samuel's ex. He apologizes to Melody and awkwardly leaves as the tape ends. Another night, and another dream sequence as Dan dreams of his past. In the dream, we find that Dan's older sister, Emily, was the one who discovered the eerie chanting melody first and becomes obsessed by it. She tells Dan that she sees ghosts all the time and that he shouldn't be afraid if he ever saw one because ghosts are just lost and don't know where to go. This scene has a very strong Sixth Sense vibes, and the way the editing incorporates multiple shots of Melody heavily implies that she's a ghost who got lost. Could the visions of Melody be a manifestation of an ability like his sister's? And should he be helping Melody find her way? Dan wakes up to the sound of a door unlocking somewhere in the compound, and he finds an unlocked bedroom and sees Melody sitting on the bed inside, reading a notebook, while a keepsake of Dan's from Steven sits next to her on the bed. Melody hears Dan approaching and asks if he was the one who wrote in all these notebooks. Considering we and Dan have only seen one on the show so far, this is a nice little foreshadowing detail. Once again, Dan asks Melody how she got there, and once again, Melody reacts as if she's present in the moment, though not exactly sure how she got there. He notices the keepsake, a box with a messed up videotape that has been mentioned a few times to have been a birthday present for Dan from Steven. It just hadn't been important to the story yet. Melody reveals that the box was already sitting on the bed when she found herself in the room. Dan talks to Melody about his father. It's a nice scene that provides a little levity for both leads, considering the show has forced them to sprint through the events of the story so far. Moved by his vulnerability, Melody shares with Dan similar interactions she's had with her own keepsake of her biological mother, a ring with a sigil that she hangs around her neck like a necklace. Dan finally reveals to Melody that she, in fact, knows his father, and the wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey implications are too much for her, and the bulb in the desk lamp that's been mysteriously on this whole time shatters. With one final call out to Dan in complete darkness, Melody disappears. When Dan switches the ceiling light on, the room is empty except for the keepsake box and the open notebook that Melody was flipping through. When Dan looks into the wardrobe cupboard in the room, he finds that it is filled with hundreds upon hundreds of notebooks, filled with soap opera notes, and that all the notebooks are signed with a T Bellows. In one of the notebooks, Dan finds pages filled with 5-digit codes written in sequential order until the list stops. Seems like this T Bellows found the right code at the end. So Dan rushes down to the off-limits section of the lower floors and tries the code in one of the other locked rooms, and it works, and he starts looking through the files in the room. He finds a folder with his father's name, and inside said folder, Dan finds articles to fringe science magazines that his father seemingly had written. An article we get an okay look of is titled The Frequency of Thought, Vibrational Manipulation as a Means of Cross-Dimensional Bridges. So keep that article in mind in particular. We cut to Dan relaying all the new findings back to Mark, who is shocked to learn that Steven had been writing for what he called parapsychology journals, commenting that the articles may have been what triggered Steven's investigation under the department's Article 6D. Among the other things in the filing cabinets in the previously locked rooms were several items found, bagged, and tagged from the wreckage of the Vista apartments, including Melody's birth mother's ring necklace and her semi-damaged journal. Dan asks Mark to track down T Bellows, and before the two end their call, Mark checks up on Dan's well-being.
Is everything good? You doing okay? I know you're hoping Melody made it out alive, so if you want to talk...
I'm fine, thanks. Good luck with the show tonight.
Hello? Dude, fuck you, I'm just trying to be sensitive.
Like I said previously, Mark is a great friend in the Netflix show. As Mark is about to start preparing for another live taping of Mystery Signals, Davenport is on stage at the location and introduces himself to Mark before questioning Mark about his friendship with Dan. This comment from Davenport is out of left field, and Matt McGorry, the actor who plays Mark, does an amazing job in this interaction.
If you don't mind me saying, you and Dan sure make a strange pair. I mean, I think it's terrific Dan has someone like you to draw him out of his shell, but I can't quite see what you get out of the relationship. Big personality like yourself.
Who says I need to get anything out of it?
Sensing the hostility from Mark, Davenport tries to appeal to him by claiming that he's worried for Dan's mental well-being, feeling that his employee is hiding things from him. He attempts to get Mark to inform him should Dan start going off the rails, and we get to see how far LMG's reaches as we get a further look into Dan's mental crisis in the past.
Dan spent 8 weeks in a residential treatment center in Vermont last year on your dime. Your father's, technically. There was some kind of a breakdown, isn't that right, over a relationship?
Wasn't about the breakup, okay? The whole thing with Jill just triggered a bunch of old family shit. Abandonment issues. He wasn't eating, he wasn't sleeping. When I found him, he was in a bad way, and he agreed to check himself in and then get help.
The scene ends a little ambiguously on where Mark stands, but luckily he is the best of best friends and does not sell out Dan when things start going more insane near the end of the series. We cut straight back to the compound as Dan watches the contents of tape 10 that he repaired off screen. Annabelle is seen obsessing and experimenting with Eleanor's ink. It's the night of the dinner party as Annabelle questions Melody about who she's been seeing in her power nap sex dreams. Melody denies that they're anything other than simply conversations. Melody tries to get Annabelle to get ready for the dinner party, but Annabelle informs her that she'll arrive at Cassandra's apartment fashionably late, like a normal person. Jess ends up opening the door to Cassandra's apartment, wearing the older woman's Karenite pendant. Cassandra had let the girl borrow the pendant for the dinner party. As the dinner party starts, Melody's attention keeps getting pulled to the locked cabinet, but during the dinner party, Jess introduces Melody to another visit tenant for a quick interview. Meet Patricia Marston. Her interview is played slightly for laughs, as she is yet another odd character and is a little awkward in front of the camera, though a few important story moments do come up in this scene. She reveals that she's lived in the Vista apartment building since 1962, the longest tenant we've met so far, and that she's now retired and spends her time staying home and recording stories like those in soap operas. Patricia's need to record stories could easily be featured in an episode of My Strange Obsession, as she reveals that she tries to be constantly recording everything and utilizing multiple VHS machines so that not a moment is missed. Patricia also comments that she believes that the recordings have a message for her, but wait a minute. Didn't T. Bellows keep notes on soap opera storylines? Anyway, Melody attempts to ask Patricia about Julia Bennett, though the woman seems to be a little too scattered to be helpful in Melody's search of her birth mother. Another tenant means another interview. Meet Helen Jung, another guest at Cassandra's dinner party. She is a sculptor who lives on the 5th floor. She's actually, in fact, the one who sculpted the creepy masks for Tamara's opera that we saw in the first 2 episodes. Everything seems normal until Melody attempts to ask Helen about the Vista cult that meets in the community room. Helen was, in fact, one of the people shown on camera during that scene in episode 2, and instead of answering, Helen just excuses herself to mingle. Before Jess leaves the apartment, she and Melody catch up, and the girl reveals that Patricia would occasionally send her in a taxi with boxes of tapes to a private storage unit in Queens. Samuel then finally enters Cassandra's apartment with Cassandra's guest of honor and a name we haven't heard of since the first episode, Evie Crest. Remember, her dad, William Crest, was the creator of The Circle, a lost media never before aired show that Dan was low-key obsessed about, and before taking the Visit Tapes job, he was repairing the only surviving copy of The Circle pilot for Evie in the first episode. Don't worry, past Joel also forgot about Evie and didn't notice the enormity of her character's appearance in this episode as well.
I found your guest outside.
Sorry, I forgot the code.
Evie?
Everyone, Evie is an actress, currently starring off-Broadway in 3 Daughters.
Oh. Oh, he knows Evie Crest. That's nice.
Shall we dine?
This shocks Dan, and in the footage, Cassandra thanks Evie for buying 2 of Eleanor's paintings. Now, this is where the actual dinner part of the party sequence starts and where Jess leaves. It's a pretty cool sequence to further explore Evie's character and her relationship with her dead father. The dinner party guests all connect over their love for William Crest's filmography, before Tamara asks Evie about the validity of the rumors surrounding The Circle. Cassandra jumps on the chances to question Evie about the rumored snuff film that seemingly inspired The Circle. Trying to get more information about the circumstances surrounding the snuff film, Cassandra prods Evie a little too forcefully, and we see the older woman glancing at Samuel, something that Melody notices herself. To quickly move on from the awkward situation that rose from her own callousness, Cassandra suggests that they all have a seance and attempt to communicate with the spirit of Evie's father for some closure. And since Beatrice is also another guest invited to the dinner party, this seems to convince Evie. As the other guests shuffle around and to prepare for the seance, Melody takes a chance to lockpick the locked cabinet in the other room, only to be caught by Samuel. He seems to always catch her when she's trying to break into something that isn't hers, funnily enough. He uses his skeleton key to unlock the cabinet. However, the sculpture inside is completely different to the one Melody saw in the community room. Cassandra casually enters the room and comments on how the sculpture is a self-portrait of Eleanor. Cassandra tells them to hurry back in the other room as they're almost ready for the seance and asks Samuel to grab a pair of tuning forks on a shelf nearby. These tuning forks are important as they've been focused on in a few shots in the cold open and the previous scenes set in the apartment, as well as being in the opening credits sequence. Also, remember Stephen's article that I mentioned before, something about vibrations and cross-dimensional bridges? Let's get into the seance. The seance begins with Beatrice using the tuning forks before inviting spirits to come to speak with those in the room, particularly William Crest's spirit. As a skeptic, Melody is understandably not taking the process seriously, glancing at the others around the table. However, as the wind howls and the candlelight flickers ominously, suddenly Beatrice shudders and her mannerisms change. Now, one could argue that it's all showmanship, so Tamara suggests Evie ask the spirit something that only she and William would know. And I have to reiterate myself once again that every actor involved in this show is perfect for their roles and are so talented. And so rather than describe the scene, I'll just let you watch it.
Do you remember my 6th birthday? It was snowing, and no one came to my party. You gave me a book.
I am nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's the pair of us. Shh. Don't tell.
Now, back in those days, when the internet isn't as widespread and information is not as easy to come by as it is today, Beatrice's accurate response to a question about an extremely private moment shared between a father and his young daughter convinces Evie straight away that William's spirit is indeed inhabiting Beatrice's body at that moment. Cassandra's insistence on finding out about the snuff film takes both Evie and Melody out of the moment, and we even get a shot of Samuel paying close attention to Beatrice. William's spirit reveals that the party where the snuff film was shown was held by Evie's godfather, Peter Crawford, and Cassandra forces Evie to ask William's spirit if he ever found a copy of the film. This time, though, William's spirit isn't as talkative, as it seems like either Beatrice or William is fighting the urge to give a straight answer. As the candlelights start to flicker once more, Beatrice/William start to sob and beg or demand for somebody or something to stay away before the seance is forced to an abrupt end. My personal interpretation of this development is William's spirit, knowing the truth of the events of the party and the snuff film, fights against the urge to answer his daughter's question and warns her to stay away, as nothing good can come from meddling with whatever is going on. But that's just how I understood it. If anybody has a different interpretation of what happened, please leave a comment so we can chat about it. It's an amazing sequence nevertheless. Beatrice returns back to normal and informs the group that she's lost him. And despite Cassandra's insistence that she try again, Beatrice shuts her down. Instead, they offer the opportunity to Melody. Now, at this point of the episode, past Joel finally realized that Annabelle is nowhere to be seen. She did promise to come 20 minutes late, but the whole dinner part of the dinner party is already done at this point. So where the hell is she? Noting that there's a real chance that Julia Bennett is already dead, Melody decides to take the offer and hands Beatrice her mother's keepsake ring. Once again, Beatrice uses the tuning forks and calls out for Julia Bennett's spirit to come and speak to them if she's around. After a moment of silent nothing, Beatrice apologizes to Melody that she doesn't sense her presence in the realm of the dead, which is, truth to be told, it's quite great news for Melody. Beatrice hands Melody the ring necklace back, but when their hands touch, something grips onto Beatrice as she claims that there's a someone else. Dan pauses the tape in shock, and Melody appears behind Dan in the compound studio, asking who it is on tape and what Dan is watching. Dan explains to Melody that he restores things, and once Melody takes another look at Beatrice, she gets a sense of deja vu and recognizes her, though she just can't remember her name. She does remember Dan's name, oddly enough. Dan then decides to tell the truth to Melody when she mistakenly claims that Dan also lives at the Vista. A realization washes over Melody's face as she mentions that she's supposed to ask Dan for help, but she doesn't know what she needs help with because everything in her head is all jumbled up. She recognizes her old journal on the console behind Dan and is confused when she realizes it's all damaged and old. And as Melody starts to panic about why Dan has her journal and her ring necklace, Dan is reminded of what his sister said about ghosts, how they're lost and confused. And so he decides to reveal to Melody that she's dead, and that she's been dead for 25 years in a fire at the Vista. Dan reveals this footage he's restoring is her footage. And like their last meeting, her heightened emotions seem to affect Dan's physical world as the electricity trips and the room is engulfed into darkness. The backup system luckily restarts really soon after, and even more luckily, the tape was not damaged in any way. Instead, it starts playing itself as Beatrice once again mentions someone else being there. The show cuts to Melody's first-person point of view as Beatrice's eyes roll back for a moment before she stares at Melody. The camera cuts between Melody's first-person point of view and Beatrice's first-person point of view as Beatrice starts to relay all of Melody's previous conversations with Dan, repeating the feature not bug line again, and these conversations even include the one that Dan just literally had in his timeline with Melody. This freaks Melody out, but surprisingly, it also seems to freak Beatrice out. And for Dan, the existence of the footage outlining the previous conversations that he thought were simply dreams or hallucinations gives him a new sense of validation that everything up to this point has been real. He hasn't started losing his mind in the isolation. Everything happened. Everything is real. He races off without finishing the tape to call Mark, but tape 10 keeps playing though, as Beatrice continues to say Dan's words and Melody's words, revealing to everyone on the table that Melody dies in the Visa fire 25 years ago. Dan's frantic words about saving Melody freaks Mark out, and Dan reveals to his friend that he's been seeing visions of Melody at the compound. As Dan is rambling, we get a shot of Mark looking at Davenport's card. We cut back to the footage in 1994 as Beatrice continues to repeat the conversation Dan just had with Melody's vision. Cassandra tries to de-escalate the tension, but Beatrice seems to not be in control of what she's relaying. Everybody at the table start to worry as Beatrice continues before she seemingly glitches like a tape, hitching on the word go, and then starts to scream no, and then she literally claws at her own freaking face. Oh! The scene cuts to Beatrice being taken away by the ambulance, leaving Melody without any answers. As she enters back into her apartment, she asks Annabelle where she's been all night before the show reveals frantic scrawling in black ink is everywhere, all over the walls, all over the papers, as Annabelle continues to frantically paint with Eleanor's paint. From a distance, a lot of the scribblings look like portraits of a woman's face in darkness. Annabelle is manic as she's frantically obsesses over the artworks.
There's someone in there.
There's someone in the paint? No, there's someone in the other place, and they're reaching out to Annabelle through Eleanor's homebrew paint. The episode ends as the camera slowly tracks closer and closer into the playback screen as tape 10 finishes on a close-up of one of Annabelle's scribbled portraits. As the camera gets close to the monitor, the footage on the screen starts to glitch and turn to static before a familiar figure starts to form from within the static, and the subtitles ominously say, "Muffled demonic snarling." Episode 5. Through the Looking Glass. Now, this episode's title references Lewis Carroll's sequel to Alice in Wonderland. The phrase also now generally means a situation where things are not what they seem. As viewers of the show, we already know that this is the case, but this is the episode when Dan finally starts to get real deep into the mystery of the Vista building. After his revelation that everything he's witnessed on the Vista tapes and around the compound have been real, no matter how strange and unreal they have been. This is the only Dan light episode of the series, as the episode focuses mostly on showing us the events of tape 11, while Dan only appears as visions for Melody in most of this episode, and we don't cut back to him until the end of tape 11 and the end of the episode. I won't be mentioning all the times Dan appears throughout the episode, but basically Melody gets cryptic, ominous visions of him like she's been appearing in the 2019 timeline, but without a lot of the conversations. The episode's cold open is in the style of a stereotypical 90s newscast intro, and the breaking story that the newscasters begin with involves a yet unidentified man being hit by a train and dying in the middle of the night. More on that later. The episode starts quietly after the opening credits, with Melody staying by Beatrice's hospital bed. The psychic is looking a lot worse for wear as thick gauze and bandages cover most of her face. When Beatrice finally wakes, Melody begs for answers about what the woman saw, but Beatrice only freaks out and cryptically warns Melody, "Don't let it out." Melody visits Stephen's office for help, only to find that he's been forced to go on leave. And this gives us the exact moment in the timeline when the university's investigation into Stephen happened because of the breach of Article 60. Rushing to the Turner home, Melody surprises Stephen. She begs for his help and explains that she believes she's being haunted and how she's been having conversations with an adult Dan. She reveals that the conversations and the identity of who she's been having them with had been fuzzy until this seance when she remembers everything about the conversations. To convince him, she mentions that she's been speaking to his son, but it doesn't seem to work as he explains to her that he's on administrative leave as someone placed an anonymous complaint on him. Judging her reaction, he realizes that the complaint wasn't filled by her. So I'll let Stephen explain the situation.
6 months ago,
a researcher put out a call looking for subjects, studying a group of people who had certain sensitivities, called them bald dog. Markers he described were identical to yours. Accounts of being pulled somewhere, of feeling that same kind of paralyzing terror, and they all made drawings, exactly like yours. He said they all had shown a genetic predisposition to unusual psychic perception.
Now, like Comet Karen, looking into Boldung online doesn't come up with anything like what is explained on the series, as it appears to be a completely original mythology developed by the creator and writers of Archive 81. Though I'm not too sure if it also appears on the podcast, I'll double check when I start working on that video. The top search result for Boldung is the Wikipedia page of a Hans Boldung, who was a German painter and printmaker, famous for his many artistic talents that led to the production of an extensive variety of work, including portraits, woodcuts, and altarpieces. His work often relied on allegories and mythological motifs, so the usage of his name in the series kind of fits. Anyway, according to Stephen, though Melody's case fit several markers for what the Boldung researcher was looking for, they ultimately concluded that she did not fit the classification. This scene also sets up the fact that in the universe of Archive 81, psychic ability seems to be usually passed down through your genetics. Unfortunately for Melody, it seems that Stephen still believes that everything she's experienced at the Vista that has gotten her to this current state of erratic madness is all from her anxieties of her search for her biological mother. And desperate for him to see that something supernatural is actually happening, Melody wants to show him the footage from the night before, but before he could see the contents of tape 10, the rest of the Turner family return home, and Melody meets 8-year-old Dan. So instead, Melody promises to send all her Vista tapes to Stephen to prove her claims. Back at the Vista, Melody chats with Jess quickly in the elevator as the latter asks how Beatrice is doing. Melody notices Jess is holding a jar full of a black substance, looking real similar to the black paint that Annabelle was using, and questions Jess about the jar. The girl stays silent, claiming client confidentiality, though Melody ultimately works out that the jar is for Samuel. Entering her apartment, Melody realizes that Annabelle has disappeared and taken her belongings with her. She attempts to ask Jess if the girl knows where her best friend went, but Erica answers the door and refuses to let Melody see her daughter. Now convinced that something conspiratorial is happening, Melody rushes back into her apartment and transfers the footage from tape 10 to a VHS and rewatches it. She's jump scared by a mysterious figure that seems to appear through the static and almost reaching out of the TV. Working frantically, she prepares a package with several VHS copies of her tapes for Stephen, and as she leaves, she's stopped by Jess, who tells her that she does know where Annabelle went. Annabelle has moved to a 6th floor apartment funded by Cassandra. Remember that John Smith informed Melody should stay off the 6th floor during his orientation of the Vista building? Melody confronts Cassandra for her actions, and the older woman accuses Melody of smothering Annabelle. Melody then visits Annabelle's new apartment and notices a nearby apartment that is fitted with multiple large locks on the outside, as if to lock something in. Annabelle lets Melody in, and we see Annabelle is still frantically painting and still using the mysterious homebrew paint. Her best friend is now obsessed with the building, claiming it's special and that she's now connected to it. Remember in the first episode how Jess claims that the building has an ability to pull people in? Unfortunately, it seems it's now gotten Annabelle. Melody begs Annabelle to come with her and leave the Vista building, but Annabelle casually reveals that Cassandra has pulled some strings with a contact and managed to give Annabelle a spot in an art show at a nearby gallery that very night. Annabelle invites Melody to see the pieces she's been working on, then as she kicks her best friend out of the apartment. In the hallway, Melody starts to hear the creepy chanting melody from the mysterious nearby apartment and decides to investigate. She records footage of the interior as she explores, and we see that the apartment is absolutely filthy, filled with graffiti all over the walls and rubbish scattered on the floor, doors that have been half broken down and not replaced, dust and grime covers almost every surface, and most disgusting of all, an odd mold seems to be growing all over the walls in an unnatural pattern. It looks kind of like flowers even. Much to her shock, Melody then realizes that there are people living in such terrible conditions in the apartment. They seem to be drug addicts of sorts and squatting in the filthy apartment. A group of addicts are standing in a circle deep in the inside and performing the ritualistic humming that we saw at the Vista Historical Society scene in episode 2. When she gets too close to the group, they stop the chant and glare at her menacingly. She then decides to leave the apartment, only to be stopped by one of the addicts, who asks her if she was sent by her father Russo. He continues to try to get her to to help, only for John Smith to barge into the apartment and escorting Melody out. Melody asks the big man why the people are locked in the apartment, and John Smith simply says that the locks are for their own protection and that the sixth floor is paid for by Samuel to allow for a safe space for the drug addicts to wean off their addictions without relapsing. As she's packing her belongings to leave the vista for good, the stranger who approached her in the sixth floor apartment appears on the fire escape, and so Melody agrees to interview him to hear his story.
Chris Lee.
How long have you been here?
2 years, maybe 20. He doesn't want us to leave. He says he needs us to open a door. Stardust. That's what brought us here. That's what keeps us here.
What's stardust? Heroin?
The mold. It grows here, running through this building like deep, dark veins. One hit, and it's like another world opens up. And there's no going back.
After a short manic moment, Chris explains that Father Russo had access to grant free entries into a nearby rehab center and promises that he would help Melody find out about Julia Bennett if she could get one of those free entries to him, as he's desperate to get clean and leave the vista. Melody heads to the church now, only to find out that the church is having a funeral for Father Russo. She finds out that Father Russo was in fact the unidentified man that was struck by a train that was mentioned in the cold open, as he was seemingly meeting somebody when the accident happened. Melody manages to break into Father Russo's office and finds an entrance form to a rehab center for Chris. She also finds a key that lets her unlock the cupboard first shown in episode 3. Inside, she finds out that Father Russo has been looking into the Vista building and its past. A lot of this information is information that the show has told the viewer, like the Voss Mansion and Comet Karen, but in the book titled A Catalog of Occult Artifacts, Gods, Demons, ... It's a long title. Here's a screenshot of it. There's a sticky note with the word Vissa ? Written on it. As Melody flips through, she recognizes a familiar totem/statue, and we finally find out the meaning of the word Kaelego. It's the name of the half-demon, half-god deity that used to be worshipped by multiple ancient people groups. In another book cataloging witch covens, Melody finds out that Father Russo has been searching into Samuel and has managed to uncover that Samuel has a number of different aliases, and as she's about to close the book, she finds herself on a page titled The Boldung Coven, and the illustration for the coven seems to include Kaelego, heavily implying that the Boldung witches used to be aligned with the demon god. The Boldung sigil just also happened to be the same pattern as her biological mother's ring. All roads point to her mother being a Boldung witch, and if it runs in the blood, does that mean Melody is too? We don't get much time to ruminate on these new findings as Melody is forced to hide her traces as a woman enters Russo's office with Samuel, who claims that the father had borrowed a book from him. Still grieving over the father's death, the woman excuses herself and leaves Samuel alone in the office. We don't get a good look at what Samuel is looking for in the office exactly, but we do see the man rip off a page on Father Russo's calendar that mentioned he was meeting somebody at midnight at the subway station. Melody is almost caught by Samuel, but luckily the grieving woman returns, which prompts Samuel to seemingly grab a random book off of Russo's shelf to keep up appearances, and she escorts him to the vigil for Russo that is about to begin. Melody calls Stephen at a payphone and erratically explains to him about the Boldung witches and her mother's ring. Now nighttime, Melody remembers about Annabelle's art show, and so she goes to the gallery. At the gallery, she attempts to tell Annabelle everything that she's found out that day, but the latter is too enthralled in her own success, I guess, and she introduces Melody to the curator of the gallery, Gabby. Gabby will be important soon. Annabelle ignores Melody's desperate pleas to leave the Vista that night, and instead shows the artwork she's been working on with Eleanor's paint. On the gallery wall, there are several portraits of a woman shrouded in darkness. Annabelle seems enraptured by her own artwork and is extremely obsessive over it. She explains to Melody that the paint lets you see into the other place, and that the woman in the portrait is trapped in there. Annabelle is convinced that she's become a spirit receiver now, like Eleanor Wall, and that freaks Melody out. Gabby returns to quickly borrow Annabelle to discuss something as Melody records the paintings. And as she closely inspects one, she realizes that the same odd mold that appeared in the 6th floor apartment is literally growing on the canvas, and works out that Eleanor must have used the same mold as a main ingredient for her own paint. Tamara is also at the gallery and mentions that the figure in Annabelle's pieces also appear in one of Eleanor's, further strengthening the connection between Annabelle and Eleanor. Jess and Cassandra are also at the gallery for some reason, following the guidance of Samuel, and speak of the devil, he's also there. How very cult leadery of him. An argument arises between Gabby and Annabelle. The latter's obsession over her own artworks is flaring once more as she refuses to sell any of the pieces. She starts to grab her pieces from the gallery walls in protest, and to try and de-escalate the situation, Melody attempts to take Annabelle away. However, Annabelle shoves her down onto the ground, agreeing with Cassandra over Melody's apparent smothering. Fed up with the day's insane events, as Melody approaches the front entrance of the Vista building, she notices that Samuel is now there, talking intensely to another man. She confronts Samuel about the 6th floor junkies and calls him by the aliases that she found in Father Russo's office and accuses him of killing Father Russo. As she questions him about her mother's possible involvement in the Bolden Coven, Samuel tries to get Melody to turn the camera off, but suddenly Chris Lee's body drops onto the ground next to the two. Melody drops her camera and screams, but the camera keeps recording as we see who Samuel had been talking to in front of the Vista building. He had been chatting to Virgil Davenport. We finally return back to Dan's point of view in the 2019 timeline, as Dan is completely shocked by Davenport's appearance in the Vista tapes. Davenport then visits Dan at the compound to explain himself.
Samuel was my brother. He had so much potential.
Though he believes his brother to be charming and egotistical, he ultimately believes Samuel to be completely harmless, even after creating a freaking cult. The reason why Davenport wants the tapes to be restored so badly is because he believes that Melody killed his brother in 1994 and that evidence of her crimes is somewhere on the tapes. Davenport even suggests that Melody might have been the one to set the Turner household on fire herself and kill the rest of Dan's family. But past Joel had one thought about this theory.
He clearly had grievances with my brother. She wanted to hurt him. She wanted to make him pay. And if she could do something like that to him, who's to say she didn't do that to your family, to your father? Who's to say she didn't burn them all?
The timeline doesn't fit.
Because it doesn't. Davenport leaves after telling Dan to finish restoring the rest of the tapes to reveal what really happened in 1994. Episode 6. The Circle. True to Dan's claim in the first episode that The Circle is a Twilight Zone-ish show before Twilight Zone, for this episode's cold open, we see William Crest on camera introducing the show a la Twilight Zone. William Crest mentions the other world that we've heard time and time again throughout the series, and the cold open finishes as Crest finishes his monologue. With a newfound determination after the events and revelations of the previous episode, Dan decides to fix the tape his dad made for his birthday. He fixes the tape and watches as Stephen introduces the tape, giving Dan words of hope and wishing Dan a happy birthday. As the montage starts, the compound's line rings. On the phone, Mark informs Dan that he's waiting just outside the compound's gates. Dan approaches the gate as Mark asks his friend if he's been doing okay since Dan has been ignoring Mark's messages. Dan attempts to get Mark to leave, but pauses when Mark reveals that he's found out more about the T-bellows that Dan asked him to look into previously. According to Alicia Flores, remember the carved TB plus AF that Dan found on a pew in the abandoned chapel? Thomas Bellows was hired by Davenport 6 years prior to archive a bunch of soap opera tapes, which would have taken a while because there were thousands and thousands of hours to go through from over 20 years ago. Sounds familiar, right? Mark explains that soon after Thomas finished his job archiving the tapes, the man had died in a car accident, and according to Alicia, Thomas went crazy while he was doing the job in the compound. Paranoid delusions, whole 9 yards. Noticing the similarities, Dan once again tells Mark to go home and that he's doing fine, and as soon as he got back into the building, Dan proceeds to destroy all the cameras, leaving Davenport in the dark. Dan restores the last of the Vista tapes, and since episode 5 seems to be the events of tape 11 in Melody's point of view, I'll call this last tape, tape 12. Tape 12 starts creepily as we see a sleeping Melody being taped by somebody. It's It's Samuel. When she wakes up, she watches the footage and she quickly records her own statement for anybody who would watch the tape after watching the creepy footage of her sleeping. And looking out the window, she notices that the police have taped up the area of where Chris had fallen to his death the night before. Outside her apartment, she's approached by a couple of cops who say that they're following up on Chris's death, and she gives them a statement in her apartment. As they're about to leave, she tells them that she believes Chris didn't commit suicide, even though that's what it's looking like happened, and that Chris wanted to get out and get better. She tells them that she believes Chris was pushed, though she doesn't know exactly who might have pushed him. She then tries to tell them of Samuel, and when she tries to give the cops proof of Sam's multiple identities, she realizes that the proof and the books that she took from Russo's office have now disappeared from her bag. Because of the manic nature of her statement, the cops theorize that Melody might have been using with Chris. Like, what a wild assumption when a clearly distressed woman is standing in front of you. Anyway, Melody attempts to tell the cops about the drug addicts trapped on the 6th floor, but then she recognizes the doubting looks on the cops' face, so she stops herself. The cops soon leave, and Melody receives a phone call from the Stuyvesant Health Center. They inform her that Annabelle had been admitted there, and we cut to Melody visiting Annabelle, who seems extremely doped up and handcuffed to the hospital bed, with bruises on her hands as well. Annabelle is too high to make any sense to Melody, once again mentioning a she that's trapped in there. The doctor then enters the room and explains to Melody that Annabelle had broken a woman's jaw the night before. Yeah, she broke Gabby's jaw to try and stop her from selling her artworks. And in the scuffle, Annabelle also stabbed a security officer in the eye with a nail. Melody is in shock, as the Annabelle that she knows has never been violent for any reason at all. And Melody quickly connects Annabelle's sudden change of behavior with the mold paint that Annabelle started using recently. And the doctor promises that if Melody could take a sample of the mold to him, he would test it to help with Annabelle's situation, with the police and all that. Melody rushes angrily to Cassandra's apartment, who feigns ignorance about her involvement in Annabelle's change of character. Cassandra has also taken all of Annabelle's paintings home and seems to be reveling in the fact that Annabelle is now a true spirit receiver. So Melody, at that point, has had enough of Cassandra being cryptic, so she pushes her against the wall and yells at the older woman. It's then revealed that Jess is in Cassandra's apartment, and Melody attempts to convince her to leave the apartment and not to trust Samuel. However, Jess backs away from her and spills the drink she's holding, and Melody works out that Cassandra has been putting the mold in the tea that Jess has been drinking with her. At this moment, Cassandra's acting seems to imply that Melody is right on the money, but there is enough ambiguity in the scene to argue that it's all Melody's overthinking everything after all that's happened to her. Melody decides to simply beg Jess to tell her where she got the jar of stuff that Melody saw in the elevator earlier, explaining that she needs a sample to show the doctor to help Annabelle. We get a clear shot of Cassandra silently telling Jess not to tell Melody, but luckily Jess provides Melody with the answer and the key to enter the basement. The basement of the Vista is absolutely covered by the patent mold, and we see that somebody has been scraping some off the walls. Before she could get a sample, she hears the familiar eerie chanting coming from behind a locked door, and as she approaches the door, she feels a presence behind her and is shocked to see Samuel, who says, "There you are." We cut back to Dan as tape 12 starts to glitch out and gets stuck in the player. Dan quickly MacGyvers away to take the tape out and is disgusted when the tape and the internals of the tape deck is absolutely covered by the mold. Dan contacts Davenport, angry about the mold that has suddenly appeared everywhere in the gear, though Davenport seemingly does not know how that could happen. Davenport reminds Dan that the latter had requested a backup tape deck just in case the first one got busted up. And we get to see a return of Ratty in the next scene when Dan goes into the storeroom to grab the spare tape deck, though he also finds a personal camcorder hidden on one of the shelves. The camcorder seemingly belongs to Thomas Bellows and has footage from Davenport's previous archivist. The footage on the SD card in the camcorder starts off as normal vlogs, since Thomas and Alicia wouldn't be able to see each other for an extended period of time. Thomas decides that sending her vlogs of his daily activities would be good. Thomas explains that the notebooks that Dan has found are Thomas's journals that Davenport has told him to write in, as he worked seemingly to make sure that Thomas has watched the contents of the VHS tapes. He's tired of watching the soaps already at this point, but he's still hopeful for the pay by the end of the job. The footage cuts to a later point in time when Thomas is about halfway through all the tapes, and we see in the background of the shot exactly just how many tapes there are, already archived at the halfway mark. Another cut, and we see Thomas carving the initials on the pier that Dan found earlier. Thomas's mood is also down as he says sorry to Alicia. His hair is more unkempt, his beard more unkempt. The two seemingly had a fight, and Thomas blames it on the job, claiming it to be sucking the life out of him. Though he still has his eyes on the prize, the pay at the end of the job is a semblance of hope for him. Another cut. Thomas has found the Wellspring files. Thomas is now observably more manic, and he believes that Davenport seems to be looking for someone through Wellspring. Once more, another cut, and Thomas is showing and questioning why there are fridges filled with blood in another part of the basement, and he reveals that Alicia has not been taking Thomas's calls since he became more paranoid and erratic. Once more, another cut. A soap opera is playing on the screen, and Thomas warns the camera that he started seeing a face in the screen. He whimpers that he's not going crazy and asks the viewer if they could see it. Tragically, we don't see it on his screens, but we have seen the face on Dan's screens, and right before Thomas has a full-on breakdown, he curses Patricia and her tapes. Patricia, huh? Familiar name. Dan recognizes the name also and replays back tape 10. Oh, and also according to Dan's workstation monitor that's shown on screen, there seems to be 15 Visa tapes, and the tape he views is tape 8. Well, the numbering I've been doing is off what we see on screen when Dan restores and enters a new tape, so I'll just continue with that numbering style because it's my video anyway. But we see Patricia Marston. Freaked out by the contents of Thomas's camera, Dan breaks into the previously locked section of the archives filled with the VHS tapes, and when he peels off the LMG deposition stickers on the tapes, it reveals that they were indeed Patricia's tapes from the Vista apartments. We cut to Dan outside calling Mark, but only getting Mark's answering machine. He explains Thomas Bellows went insane archiving tapes from the Visa, and that Thomas has been seeing the same things that Dan has, but unfortunately the call drops and he notices Bonnie approaching him. Bonnie says that Davenport sent her to help Dan find the replacement deck, but when Dan informs her that he's found it already, she turns to leave. He stops her in her tracks and asks her about Thomas Bellows. Bonnie cryptically warns him not to make the same mistake, and to just finish the job, take the money, and leave without looking back. The episode cuts to the interior of an antique store, and we get the first glimpse of Jill, Dan's ex-girlfriend. Mark is sitting inside waiting for her and explains that he's heard a rumor that Evie Crest died of a stroke the week prior and that her son is selling off William Crest's archive. Jill pretends to not know anything about it, but Mark knows her better and knows that she's bought the collection. The only reason she knows of William Crest and his collection is because Dan was obsessed with the circle, so Jill finally relents and reveals that she was planning on telling Dan about her buy, but she found out that he didn't work at the museum anymore, and Mark refuses to tell her where Dan is. Now, this is a nice little nod to Mark's and Tanya's relationship in the podcast. They don't like each other. Obviously, the context of why Dan's best friend and Dan's girlfriend / ex-girlfriend hates each other has changed, but it's still nice to see. Mark explains that Dan will never forgive Jill for cheating on him, even if she brought him his odd obsession that's been considered lost media for decades, and he manages to convince Jill to give him the tapes. Part of the collection that Jill has bought included occult books like Boldung Book of Shadows and something to do with the Voss Society, further solidifying the Crest family being unfortunately deeply intertwined with the events of their series. Another item in the collection is an old photo of the members of the Voss Society, and we get introduced to a new character named Iris Voss. She looks exactly the same as the person in Annabelle's paintings. More on that in the next episode. Jill reveals to Mark that the collection she bought also had the snuff film that inspired the creation of the circle, ominously titled The Ritual. We cut back to Dan at the compound as he's finished connecting the backup deck and cleaning up tape 12 of the mold. The playback this time is normal once more, and Dan finds a spot the tape had messed up on previously. Turns out Samuel was legitimately just looking for her since she disappeared from his apartment when he came back with coffee and croissants. This guy just can't stop trying to charm people. It's kinda ick. Melody questions him about what happened the previous night after Chris fell, and Samuel claims that Melody fainted. She then asks him about the state of the basement, and Samuel casually answers that the basement area used to be storage before it was flooded years prior. Samuel's gaslighting is next level as he pretends not to know about the special mold all over the walls, but when Melody is not having any of it, and once Samuel realizes that all pretenses are useless now, he drops the act and claims that the mold is...
I guess if I had to answer that, I would say it is proof of our devotion. It's a manifestation of the divine. It's the matter of a shared universe.
He unlocks the previously locked door in the basement and tells Melody that he wants to show her something and that he has all the answers she's been looking for. Melody follows him through the door and down a set of stairs as Samuel explains to her that the Vista building was built upon the ruins of a mansion, the Voss mansion. At the bottom of the steps, there is a pristine area untouched by the mold, and upon a pedestal sits the K-Lego statue. A lectern with a big old book is next to it, and a group of drug addicts chanting the eerie chant is nearby. The chant once again affects Melody, and Samuel explains that the chant is a prayer, and the fact that Melody is affected by it means that she is the person he's been looking for. This is where Samuel reveals that Julia Bennett never lived in the Vista. He had sent the letter himself to the convent to lure Melody to the Vista after Stephen Turner reached out with her case file. That's right, Samuel was also the Baldung researcher Stephen reached out to. At this point, Samuel explains the importance of the ritual, and I think it's best if I let him say it. It will be chopped up because it is quite a long sequence for YouTube to try and get through Content ID. So if you do want to see it in a less choppy way, consider becoming a paid member of my Patreon so that you get access to the extended cut of the video with less chops and no filters. But here's Samuel explaining almost everything.
Was my mother one of your seers?
No, I'm sorry. I never knew your mother. She never lived at the Vista. I sent the letter to the convent. I was hoping that you would come looking for the thing you wanted most in the world. And you did. And Professor Turner was kind enough to help me find you, because there aren't many of you out there. I am so very lucky that I found you. Melody, please, take heart. At this time, we're going to succeed. And the whole of time will be as one.
Samuel shows Melody the snuff film that they managed to find somehow, and Melody recognizes that she is standing in a replica of the setting of the snuff film. Samuel confirms her suspicions, and as the music climaxes, we see the cult leader on the snuff film suddenly slice the neck of a girl and killing her heartlessly. Melody understandably assumes that she's destined to be the sacrifice for the ritual, but Samuel assures her that she's safe and that he already has a volunteer for the sacrifice.
We have our volunteer. Our vessel, capable of holding a whole new world inside of them.
Melody ultimately rejects Samuel's attempts in getting her to join him and runs back to her apartment. She has a quick emotional breakdown from the reveal that her mother was never at the Vista, but once she's settled a little, she works out through what Samuel said that the volunteer he mentioned to be a vessel was Jess.
Do I seem strong enough to hold a new world inside of me?
Pounding on Jess's apartment door, Melody calls out for her, but Tamara answers, claiming that Jess and Erica had moved out of the apartment to Florida. By the way, from this point on, we never see Erica again. We can safely assume that she's been taken care of by the cult. Stepping into the stairwell, we finally arrive chronologically at the portion of the tape that we saw at the cold open of episode 1 and its cliffhanger ending. Whilst rewinding the tape to rewatch the ending again with Melody being taken out by Rockland employees and his father being there, the display starts to glitch out as K-Lego appears once more on Dan's screen. This time, almost as if stretching the boundaries of the screen in an attempt to break out. Dan quickly grabs a heavy wrench nearby and destroys the screens in the room. Scared that K-Lego might be able to step out into the real world through anything that came from the Vista building, Dan starts rampaging through the tapes that he restored, the VHS tapes that Thomas archived, and destroying as much as he could. During the destruction, he accidentally pokes a hole in the drywall and notices the familiar mold peeking out from behind it. It's then that he notices that underneath one of the shelving cabinets of the VHS tapes that there is a grate completely covered with the mold as well, and he opens the grate, revealing a metal ladder to an even deeper section of the compound. Dan cautiously makes his way down some steps, and we see that it's almost identical to the set of steps that we had just witnessed Melody walking down in the final Vista tape. Dan arrives at yet another replica of the ritual room, only this time, multiple digital displays of the digitized version of the Vista tapes play all over the walls. As Dan is about to destroy the displays and all the other technology present in the room with a copy of the Vista tapes, he is knocked out by an unknown assailant. Episode 7. The Ferryman. A majority of this episode focuses and explores Iris Voss and how she relates to the events of the series. Iris is played by the talented Australian actress Georgina Haig, and as I've repeatedly said throughout this whole video, everyone that was cast was absolutely perfect for their role. I swear. But before we get to her storyline, let's resolve the little cliffhanger from the previous episode. Dan wakes up in his own apartment from a nightmare of him coughing up the mold that he found in the compound at the last episode. He has no memory of how he got back into his own apartment, and he doesn't have any of his belongings that he took with him, like his phone. He storms to the LMG building and into Davenport's office, only to find Davenport is not physically in the office, and instead he talks to Dan through the screen. Davenport thanks him for completing the job of restoring and digitizing the visitapes, and claims that Dan had collapsed after pushing himself too hard restoring and digitizing the last tape, and that LMG staff had transported him back to his apartment after doing a full medical checkup on him. Davenport ignores Dan's conspiratorial claims about the secret underground passage beneath the compound, claiming it to be simply hallucinations, but when Dan refuses to back down, Davenport reminds him that Dan did in fact commit a huge amount of property damage when he destroyed the tapes. So Davenport advises Dan to take the money and forget everything that happened in the compound. Hopeless and once again without leads, Dan screams in frustration. When he gets back home, he finds Mark is looking around his apartment for something to play the ritual. He's grateful that Dan is alive and well. He's a really good friend. Luckily, since the SD card from Thomas's camera was on Dan's person, it was not taken away by Davenport and LMG, so Dan shows Mark the footage in the SD card. Dan explains to Mark that he also has been seeing a figure in the footage he's been working with. Have I already said how good of a friend Mark is? Because he trusts Dan's claims straight away and shows Dan what he has catalogued from the William Crest collection. The collection includes the stuff we've seen prior, but also includes spirit photographs, photos that seem to capture spirits, ghosts, figures from the other world. And Dan connects the dots that Iris Voss is the figure featured in Annabelle's artworks at the gallery. And from this point on, the perspective of the episode changes to New York City 1924 as we follow Iris Voss and the events that lead up to the ritual, while Mark and Dan watch the snuff film. The 1924 storyline follows Iris Voss and her two brothers, Lucas and Jonah, in their quest to fulfill their dead father's wishes of discovering the truth about Kay Lego. We see Iris hiring a new maid. You can call her Iris. Fuck. This recording is 2.5 hours with mistakes and outtakes. Oh, it's been a long time talking. We see Iris hiring a new maid, Rose, to help her as she is pregnant, and Iris uses familiar language to Rose when she tells the latter that she is special and is capable of holding a whole new world inside of her. That night, as the Voss siblings are holding a party, Rose notices the Karenite necklace Iris is wearing. This necklace seems to be the same jewelry that Cassandra wears in 1994. While Rose serves champagne to the party guests, Iris meets an Emma Trelay, who describes herself as a poet and someone who's been trying to join the society for several years and mentions a return. Gathering the party guests, Iris shows off the Kay Lego totem that her brothers recently found before she leads the group into a chanting prayer. It's the familiar chant that we've heard throughout the whole series, and note that the prayer starts with a Voss brother using 2 tuning forks, like how the seance started in episode 4. Later, after the party, Rose stumbles upon Iris bleeding in the bathroom due to pregnancy complications. The episode cuts to Iris being bedridden after a doctor's visit, and unfortunately Iris has had a miscarriage, and she has a crisis of faith as the doctor had warned her if she continued to attempt to fulfill her lifelong dream of having a child, she would die. The episode cuts to Rose cleaning the bathroom floor where Iris had her miscarriage, as a familiar mold has started to grow around that area. Iris quickly tells her to stop, as the mold is a demonstration of their devotion to Kay Lego. It's very similar language to what Samuel was saying in the previous episode. That night, Rose wakes up to hear a glass shatter, and she catches Emma attempting to steal Iris's Kay Lego cult book. She tries to convince Rose to run away with her, warning her about the nefarious plans Iris has in store for Rose, but soon, Iris and her brother, Jonah, approach the room and surrounding the poet. Iris recognizes Emma as a Baldung witch, and the two argue over Kaelego's nature, as the Baldung witches used to call the demon god for power, but Emma reveals the reason why they don't rely on Kaelego anymore and losing their power is because it is a source of destruction for everyone, and that Kaelego is not a god or a savior like the Voss siblings seem to think it is. When Emma threatens to burn the book, Jonah shoots Emma and kills the witch, much to the dismay of Iris, as they needed her, or to be more specific, her blood, for some sort of ritual. Instead, Iris orders everyone to collect as much of Emma's blood as possible. And also, I didn't write this in the script, but as a note, I remembered the whole Thomas talking about the fridge of blood. It's now revealed that blood of a Baldung witch is required for the ritual. Therefore, that's why LMG has a fridge filled with blood. Just a note that I realized rewatching the episodes and rewriting the script and stuff like that I'd never addressed. So we cut to the Comet Karen viewing party, or whatever it is, and Iris catches Rose praying to the Christian god and is disappointed that the latter is still praying to a false god. It's obvious by now that Iris is already in too deep into the cult that her father introduced the family to. After reaffirming Rose's determination to join the Kaelego cult, Iris gifts the Black Karenite necklace to Rose to wear at the party, and instead of serving at the party, she's now a guest at the party. Whilst the party is raging, Iris notices her other brother, Lucas, leaving before the main ceremony began, and she chases after him. Lucas knows that he can't change his older sister's mind in whether or not to perform the ceremony, and he disagrees in sacrificing everybody who believes that this is just a mere party, so instead, he decides to leave while he still could. Entering the mansion once more, she thanks the guests for their attendance and gives them a toast. She then leads Rose down a familiar set of stairs to the ritual room in the basement. She tells Jonah to start recording the ritual, and instead of breaking down every step of the ritual, I'll just let you see it, slightly edited to bypass Content ID, of course.
Då bälde alltså ene, lishes nu arandin. Chokat och chokat, blod och blod.
As she completes the ritual, a bright light seems to originate from above the group as some sort of misty portal starts to form in front of them all before the snuff film abruptly ends. We cut back to the 2019 storyline now, and desperate to know what happened with Samuel's attempt at the same ritual, Mark helpfully reminds Dan and suggests that they visit Annabelle Cho, who is still staying at Rockland after the events of episode 6. And once they enter her room, Annabelle asks if one of them is Dan, and she teases Dan about how long it took him to visit and that she, Melody, has been waiting for him all this time. In her room, Annabelle has paintings of Melody shrouded in darkness, similar to her artworks of Iris previously at the art show, all over her walls, and informs Dan and Mark that Melody is stuck in the other world. Oh yeah, that's what the other world is called. And that they need to help get Melody out. Episode 8. What Lies Beneath. The cold open for this episode is a sober and calm assortment of clips of Jess and Melody during one of Jess's errand runs before shit hit the fan, recorded on Jess's camera that was introduced all the way in episode 2. The episode starts by continuing Melody's storyline. On the night that she's taken into Rockland, Stephen visits Melody and explains that he has admitted her to Rockland to save her from Samuel's clutches, as he has received her tapes and realized that Samuel was the researcher that made the Baldung call-out. This revelation was kind of skimmed over by Samuel in episode 6, and obviously Melody, who was too overwhelmed to fully understand the situation as well. Stephen tries to explain his plan to keep Melody safe from Samuel's reach, but she tells him that Samuel has taken Jess and is planning to use the girl as a human sacrifice for his delusional ritual. He then lets Melody meet Annabelle, who had been transferred to Rockland at some point, and even in that short amount of time, Annabelle has already started covering the wall completely with portraits of Iris in darkness. Annabelle is obviously still obsessed with Iris, and it's only after Melody tells her that Iris is a murderer that Annabelle starts to scratch out the portrait's eyes. Annabelle reveals that Comet Karen will be visible that very night, and that Cassandra has revealed to her that the cult was planning on doing the ritual then. Annabelle attempts to get her friend to stay, but Melody is determined to save Jess and escapes Rockland. Dan is relieved that his father seemed to not have anything to do with the cult, and Annabelle informs the two that Melody is stuck in the other world and is adamant that she did not die in the Visifire. Before the two leave, Annabelle gives Dan a box of tapes from Jess, who thankfully survived the Visifire and is now known as Sister Mary Cecilia, stationed in Haiti. Back in Dan's apartment, the audio tapes seem to be a bust, as they only play low, growling, ominous sounds, but Dan soon has a revelation though.
Fisher Price, PXL 2000. Shitty quality video camera for kids. It's only on the market for about a year. I got one on eBay about 10 years ago. Jess had one. They shoot on audio cassettes.
One of the tapes seemed to pick up when Melody returns to the Visa building and has picked up Jess's camera. She leaves a statement on tape just in case law enforcement found the camera. She makes her way up to the 6th floor and finds that Jess is locked in the same apartment that Cassandra had let Annabelle borrow. Since the door is deadbolted and Jess doesn't have the key, Melody breaks into the drug addict's apartment and uses the fire escape to get inside the apartment Jess is in. At first, Jess refuses to come with Melody when the latter suggests they run away from the Visa, and it's not until Melody tells the young girl that the cult means to sacrifice her that Jess's willingness to stay wavers. Seeing the genuineness in Melody's warnings, Jess starts to climb onto the fire escape, but before Melody could follow her, John Smith knocks menacingly at the door of the apartment, calling for Jess. Melody instructs the Jess to climb down the fire escape and get to the street as fast as possible, promising that she'll be right behind the little girl, and gives her her bag of tapes and her camera. John Smith then manages to unlock the door, and Melody stops him from chasing after Jess, who thankfully is now running down the street away from harm. Angered by her interference, John Smith clocks one on her and she's knocked out. Melody quickly regains consciousness, tied up in the ritual room, surrounded by Samuel and all the cult members. Samuel tells Melody that she was the one that he really needed anyway. He then gifts Tamara with the Karenite necklace, signifying that she'll be the new sacrifice. This is something that Tamara notes herself, though she ultimately yields to Samuel. The ritual soon commences as Samuel repeats the same steps that we saw Iris perform in the previous episode. The masks made for Tamara's opera is used for the ritual, as well as everything we've seen in the previous episodes, and the series' opening credits seem to come together. The tuning forks, the chanting, the masks, the Lego figure being bathed by Melody's blood, and it all culminates to Tamara's throat being cut as the sacrifice. Once again, the Misty Portal appears in front of the group, and everyone present sees a vision of Iris Voss from within the portal. This catches Samuel by surprise, as the ritual was supposed to open the gateway to Lego's dimension and let him through. Melody hears Jess calling out to her as the girl has returned in time to catch the ritual on her camera, and Melody tells Jess to run as Samuel grabs her arm and they enter the portal. As Jess runs up the stairs, she's barely able to get away from the blazing fire that erupted from the portal, as something went wrong. This is something that she has only accidentally captured on camera, and we now know what caused the Voss Mansion's destruction, as well as the Vissa apartment fire. Mark breaks down everything they know so far, so I'll let him do the heavy work here.
Iris Voss, 1924. She and her high society cult of Kalego worshippers execute a ritual. Ugly shit, human sacrifice. Something goes wrong, big explosion, Voss Mansion collapses, everyone dies, no bodies are found. Fast forward to 1994. Professor Samuel Spare, or whatever the fuck his name is, moves into the Visser, fires up the cult again. He gathers a ragtag congregation, collects all the necessary occult accoutrements, and he lures Melody, an unwitting Baldung witch, into his web. Tries the ritual again, what happens? Same fucking disaster. Except this time through the miracle of not quite modern technology, we get a better look. If you believe all the crazy shit that we've been sifting through, if you put any stock in the Baldung Mystics and the Voss Society and the Visser Gang, you'd say we got a glimpse into Kalego's hometown.
The other world.
Some kind of shadow dimension or a pocket universe or mirror world. That spell, that ritual, it opens a kind of door or an access point, a place where two dimensions briefly intersect. And in 1924, Iris reached into that other dimension and tried to pull out a fistful of Kalego.
And said she got pulled inside. Melody, she could be stuck there too.
For the sake of argument, let's say that Melody got pulled inside by accident, and let's say that these visions you've been having, these weird conversations and waking dreams, that they're her way of sending an SOS from the other side.
I need to get her out. Oh, well, Davenport clearly has some kind of plan. Davenport knows how to get to Melody.
We cut to nighttime, and Dan approaches Davenport at the compound gates. At first, Davenport refuses Dan entry, but Dan later convinces him to open the gates, promising that doing so would allow Davenport to know the ending of his brother's story. Inside the compound, before giving Davenport the rest of the tapes, Dan interrogates the older man. Davenport reveals that the reason why he waited 25 years to find out what happened to the Visser was because he only managed to gather the tapes recently after they were put up to auction when a storage facility was emptied, a storage facility owned by Stephen Turner. Davenport also accuses the Bolden coven at this point of burning the Turner household to prevent the possibility that Stephen would use the knowledge captured in the tapes to summon K-Lego. Dan attempts to get Davenport's help to save Melody from the Otherworld, but the other man deems it impossible as he believes that the Otherworld does not have a hospitable environment for humans. Desperate and out of options, Dan attempts to overpower Davenport, but the latter is surprisingly strong and almost shoots Dan before Mark knocks him out with a crowbar. Mark wants to leave before Davenport regains consciousness, but Dan begs his friend to help him perform the ritual again to open the portal to save Melody. And Mark, being the best of best friends, agrees to help him.
If you're really gonna do this, I'm not gonna leave you here. Fuck you for thinking that I would.
The two head down to the replica ritual room and is held up by Bonnie before they could start the ritual. She tells the boys that both times the ritual was performed, the offending parties believed that they had everything they needed, when in fact they were missing a couple of things. One, a specific tuning fork that aligns the vibrations, and two, an actual Bolden witch to perform the spell. Mark then makes the connection that Bonnie is a Bolden witch. Dan then quickly figures out that Bonnie also wants to get Melody out of the Otherworld, and that Bonnie is in fact Julia Bennett, Melody's biological mother. And so she explains the reason why she abandoned Melody was to spare her from being involved with the events of the series. Dan and Mark offer up their help to save Melody, and Bonnie finally agrees to perform the ritual. This time the ritual works as intended, and she warns Dan that she can only hold the portal open for 5 minutes, as Dan steps into the portal and is transported into the Otherworld. Unfortunately, the Otherworld is quite disappointing. It has the atmosphere It has the atmosphere of being the Upside Down, but the one that we have at home, which is bizarre considering Stranger Things is also a Netflix property. However, whilst in the Otherworld, Dan is transported into a version of his childhood home and is almost tricked by a fake reality where his family is alive and well, created by K-Lego to try and trap Dan inside the Otherworld. Determined to find Melody, Dan finds himself then transported to a maze of never-ending Visser hallways, but through one door, it inexplicably leads him to the community room where he had his first conversation with Melody, and in there he hears the song Love Will Tear Us Apart by Joy Division playing softly, and decides to follow the tune. Although I prefer the Fall Out Boy cover. Through the blinds of the community room, he finds himself in a replica of the church Melody was abandoned at and finds Melody listening to the Joy Division song. He convinces her to follow him, though as soon as he agrees, the serene surroundings start to tremble as K-Lego is obviously unhappy about Dan's incursion into his realm. The two run, but after a while, Dan realizes that something is wrong and finds an old TV with footage of the compound. Every time he switches the channels on the TV, the footage on screen changes to a different camera surveilling another area of the compound. Melody separates from him at this point, being drawn in by the chant before she is cornered by K-Lego. Luckily, Dan manages to grab her and they run through the twisting Visser hallways once more. This time, they find themselves in the area like where Melody was taken by the Rockland employees, and Dan could finally hear the tuning fork signaling the way back to the real world. However, through one of the doors, Samuel appears and grabs Melody away from Dan, and the two run through a portal before Dan could save her, and she finds herself in the replica ritual room with Bonnie and Mark. Mark asks her where Dan is, but all Melody could say was that Dan was right next to her, but then Samuel was also there in the other world. And shortly after, the portal closes. We then cut to Dan waking up at a hospital. He calls out for anyone around, and a nurse enters his room explaining that he's been unconscious for 10 days. She explains that he's had no visitors when he asks for Mark. When she mentions that he was luckier than his neighbors at the Visser building, he starts to panic and asks her what year it is. The nurse decides to get the doctor for him, and on the TV in his room, Dan sees that the year is 1994 and that Kurt Cobain has just been pronounced dead. And that's the show. Act 4. Restoration Piece. To say that I was disappointed by the ending of the series would be an understatement. The series started off perfectly, strongly building upon the strengths of the podcast it is adapting and having a very talented cast performing their hearts out. The writing in the first 6 episodes is some of the best TV writing I've ever seen. No line was wasted, no shot was pointless. Hell, even the opening credits was absolutely full of references to things and events that were yet to come. Unfortunately, due to the volatile nature of Netflix's relationship to its own products, even though show on its release month, Archive 81, was one of Netflix's most watched programs, apparently clocking in at around 128.47 million hours globally watched, according to Netflix Top 10s, the show was axed just after one season. And that's where Archive 81's 7th and 8th episodes suffered, as they were left to lay down the foundations of a second season that was never destined to come. The pacing of the series slowed down on the 7th episode as it focused solely on the Voss storyline to build upon the reveal of the contents of the snuff film, The Ritual. And though the episode does serve as revealing an answer to a long-standing series mystery, compared to the number of events depicted in the previous 6 episodes, it is noticeably slower. The series' final episode is left with the fate of being an episode full of setups for a non-existent second season. Due to this primary function, the reveals that end up being present in the episode are few and far between compared to what it had to set up. The unconfirmed reveal that the Bolden Coven were the ones who murdered the Turner family has the disadvantage that it came from an untrustworthy source, Davenport. While the reveal of Bonnie's identity is nice for that storyline after, and does, upon rewatching the show for this script, have its foreshadowing moments, think back to how emotional Bonnie looked like when Dan caught her watching Melody in episode 3, it can't hold up the viewer's expectations as a season finale reveal. And finally, as Episode 8 is the first proper episode that the viewers get of the other world, assuming that the dream conversations that Melody and Dan had throughout the series were not glimpses into Kerlego's realm, though there is an argument to be made that they may have taken place in Kerlego's other world's realm, as Bonnie does mention time does not work the same way there as it does in the real world. Dan's predicament of becoming trapped in the past does not make sense. In fact, I had a pretty strong deja vu reaction to that cliffhanger, as it gave me the same unsatisfied feeling as a viewer to that of the ending of 2001's Planet of the Apes. Obviously, had the show received a second season, no doubt they might have tried to explain how Dan got stuck in the past, but looking at it as a singular season as a whole, the cliffhanger kinda came out of nowhere. Since there was only one mention of time shenanigans in the Otherworld in the whole series, and it was literally done before Dan entered the Otherworld, therefore it makes the whole cliffhanger reveal feel really unearned. And a final note, unlike the SG1 video, I found it hard to write the recaps of these episodes in a more efficient way than using the play-by-play style because of the nature of the storytelling and the mystery. The show just interweaves important events from both timelines so intricately that there wasn't really any other way to recap the show without ruining the pacing of the reveals. All in all, Archive 81 is still a solid watch for at least 3/4 of the runtime. And it does make me feel a lot more confident that the podcast will be a whole lot better than its adaptation. Act 5. Resolution. And that brings us to the end of this recap and semi-analysis video on Netflix's Archive 81. Like I said at the start of the video, I will be making a follow-up video on the podcast. For now, I really do hope you enjoyed this journey with me. Like I said, Archive 81 was a good alternative to the Magnus Archives as a form of entertainment, especially in the horror scripted podcast medium. Once again, I will be making a video on the Magnus Archives, a series of videos recapping the seasons. There are 5 seasons. Very good show. Check it out. Check out Archive 81, the podcast, or even the show. Like, I know that I've already given quite a detailed recap of the show, but it's still really nice. It's a really well-made show. I do have a little bit of gripes with how the show ended the ending, but it's still a good show. I feel like if any of this still interests you, give it a watch, because I am trying to make sure that a lot of the moments, a lot of the reveals I'm not showing. If you want to experience them, you know, the best way is to actually watch the stuff. But if you enjoyed the video at all, please give the video a like, as it really does help out with the algorithm. Also, if you've enjoyed my somewhat totally not slightly in-depth recap of Archive 81, my dog's barking. Also, if you've enjoyed my somewhat totally not slightly in-depth recap of Archive 81, may I suggest subscribing to my channel, as I am striving to continue this kind of content, because I'm immensely enjoying creating it. Finally, if you're so inclined, I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description. My Patreon will have regular free updates for free members, as well as plenty of exclusive content for paying members, including the whole uncut videos of my first impressions of Archive 81, as I've stated multiple times throughout this video, as well as the ability to watch the extended cuts, which is the best way to watch them, because the stuff that I need to do to try and bypass Content ID on YouTube ruins it completely, and you get access to it a day earlier than the YouTube version. But as always, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.